The room was dark, almost too dark. The only light coming in was from the faint glow of the street lamp outside, casting long, thin shadows through the curtains. Emma shifted under the covers, her body exhausted after another long day. She had been busy at work, then attended a friend's party, and now all she wanted was to fall asleep in the quiet of her own room. The clock on her nightstand blinked 11:52 p.m., a time that always made her feel a little uneasy, as if the night was at its peak of darkness. Her eyes fluttered closed, her breathing slowing. But then a strange sensation crawled over her, a feeling she couldn't explain. It wasn't the usual chill of the night air, nor the whisper of the wind outside. No, this was different. This was a sensation of being watched. Her eyes snapped open. She stared at the ceiling, her mind racing as she lay perfectly still, waiting for the creeping dread to pass. She told herself it was just her imagination, but something tugged at the edges of her thoughts. The shadows in the corners of the room were stretching, reaching out further than usual. One shadow, in particular, caught her attention, the one near her closet. At first, it was nothing, just a trick of the light. But as she stared, the shadow seemed to grow longer, twisting unnaturally. The air felt colder. Her heart started to race. It's nothing, she tried to convince herself. Just the shadows playing tricks. But then she heard it, the faintest rustling sound, like something shifting in the dark. Emma held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't imagining it. The sound was there, growing louder. It was coming from the corner of the room where the shadow had been stretching. She forced herself to sit up, pulling the covers tightly around her. The room was still and silent. Too silent. The only sound now was the blood rushing in her ears. She glanced quickly at the clock. 11:54 p.m. The time felt wrong, as though the minutes were stretching on forever. Her mind raced. She could hear a faint whispering now. Too quiet for her to understand, but it was there, just beyond her hearing. Slowly, Emma turned her head towards the corner of the room. She knew she shouldn't, but she couldn't help herself. There, in the farthest corner of the room, the shadow was still there, but now it seemed different. The shape was clearer now, a dark mass that shifted in place. It was moving, but not in the way a shadow would. It was too solid, too defined. No, no, no! Emma's mind screamed, her pulse racing as her instincts told her to look away, to ignore it. But the shadow didn't want to be ignored. It was almost as if it knew she was watching it, because the moment she focused on it, it started to move towards her, slowly, silently. It didn't move like a natural shadow, like the flicker of light that bends and shifts. It was deliberate. It was alive. Emma couldn't tear her eyes away. Her breathing hitched. She could see a faint outline now, a figure inside the shadow. Tall, thin, with elongated limbs. It wasn't a human shape, but something else, something unnatural. Before she could process what was happening, the figure stopped moving. It was standing at the edge of her bed now, just at the foot. It had no face, no distinct features. Just a void where its face should be, a black hole of emptiness that drew her in. The air around her grew colder, so cold that her breath fogged in the air. But it wasn't just the temperature, it was the feeling, the sense of dread, of something unspeakably wrong in the room with her. Her body trembled. She wanted to scream, to jump out of bed, but her body refused to obey. She was frozen, her eyes locked onto the figure. It was closer now, so close she could almost feel its presence. It was right at the edge of the bed. Don't turn around. She heard a voice whisper in her head. It wasn't her voice. It wasn't even a voice at all. It was more like an urge, a command. Don't turn around. But Emma couldn't stop herself. Slowly, inch by inch, her head began to turn, the weight of the figure pulling her gaze in its direction. The shadow was right behind her. She could feel it. She could sense its breath, cold and damp, against her neck. The whisper grew louder. Don't turn around. But it was too late. Her body jerked involuntarily, her head whipping back to face the figure. But when she looked, it was gone. The shadow, the shape, it was no longer there. Only the empty room remained. Emma didn't sleep that night. How could she? Every time she closed her eyes, she saw it The shadow, its shape, its presence, the feeling of cold breath against her skin. It haunted her, lingering at the edge of her consciousness, growing stronger with every passing minute. When dawn finally broke, she rose from her bed, feeling like she hadn't slept a wink. The room felt different. The air was still thick, as though something unseen still lingered there. Shaking, she moved through her morning routine, trying to ignore the gnawing dread in her stomach. But it was impossible to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Her mind kept racing back to Shadow. Was it just her imagination? Could she have dreamed it? No, it was too real, too vivid. Her phone buzzed with a text from her friend Sarah. "Hey, how are you doing? You okay?" Emma quickly typed back, "I don't know. Something happened last night. I need to talk to you." Sarah replied almost immediately, "What happened?" "I saw something in my room. It wasn't a shadow. It was real. I think it's still here." Sarah didn't respond right away. Emma stared at her phone, willing her friend to reply. But it wasn't Sarah's message that made her heart skip a beat. It was a soft, rustling sound coming from her room. The same sound. The same whispering. She didn't have to turn around to know it was there. And this time, she wasn't alone. Emma's body froze. The sound came again. It was a rustling, but now it was louder, more distinct. It wasn't just a trick of the wind or the creaking of the house. It was intentional, like something moving within her room. Her heartbeat thudded in her chest, each beat louder than the last, each pulse amplifying the growing dread in her veins. She could feel the air around her growing heavier, the walls seeming to close in. She stood in place, paralyzed, as though some invisible force was holding her in place. Her feet felt glued to the floor. "Don't turn around." That voice urged again, but it wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was inside her mind, echoing through every thought, every nerve ending. "Don't look," but she couldn't help it. Slowly, with her breath caught in her throat, Emma turned her head toward the doorway of her room. She wasn't sure why she did it. Perhaps it was the overwhelming need to know what was causing the sounds, or the sickening curiosity that filled her every fiber. But when her gaze met the dark threshold of the doorway, her stomach dropped. The door was slightly ajar, but something else stood beyond it, lurking in the pitch blackness. She couldn't see it clearly, but she could sense it, its presence, thick and suffocating. There was something just out of view, something that didn't belong. Her eyes darted to the corner where the shadow had stood the night before. There was nothing there now, just the usual jumble of furniture. Yet Emma could feel it. Something had shifted. Something was watching her from within that darkness. Her pulse hammered in her ears, louder than any rustling noise. The room felt suddenly oppressive, as if the very air was charging with malevolent energy. She had to look. She had to understand. With a trembling hand, she reached for her phone, still resting on the coffee table by the window. The screen lit up with a text she had sent to Sarah. No new responses. But as her fingers brushed across the glass to unlock the phone, she caught something in the corner of her eye. A flicker, a fleeting movement. It was at the edge of her vision, just past the door frame. She snapped her head towards it. Nothing. The corner was empty. The room, still. She stood there, her heart a drumbeat in her chest. She could feel the presence moving now, slowly, deliberately, like a predator inching closer. The door creaked open more, a low, groaning sound that filled the room with a sense of impending doom. Then the whispering returned. This time it was louder, clearer. It wasn't just a voice. It was a chorus, a cacophony of murmurs that swirled around her, indecipherable but all too real. Emma, her breath hitched. She froze. It was her name, spoken softly, but in a voice that wasn't hers. Not human. "Don't turn around." It was there again, the voice, but now it wasn't inside her head. It was coming from behind her, too close for comfort. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Her entire body screamed for her to run, but her feet remained nailed to the floor. Her breath became shallow, her head spinning as the shadows seemed to lengthen around her, reaching. Don't turn around." The whisper came again, and then the pressure grew stronger. She felt a hand, no, a presence on the back of her neck. Cold fingers, like ice, running down her skin. Her body shuddered uncontrollably, the sensation being touched in such a way by something that didn't belong in the world of the living, paralyzing her with fear. And then, without warning, the voice stopped. The room was silent. For a heartbeat, Emma thought maybe she had imagined it, that it was all just some sick nightmare. Maybe she was still asleep in her bed, caught in a dream. She glanced nervously around, looking for anything at all, that could explain the dread that had gripped her. But the room was too still, too quiet, and that's when she saw it, a shadow. It was tall, angular, impossibly long. But this wasn't the same shadow from before. This one seemed to have substance, as though it had grown from the very darkness of the room, emerging from the corner where the light could no longer reach. It twisted and stretched like something alive, like it was aware of her, tracking her movements. She blinked, and it was closer, her breath caught in her throat. Her eyes widened in horror as the shadow crept toward her, like a living, breathing thing. It didn't move like a shadow should. It didn't flow or flicker with the light. Instead, it slithered, dragging itself slowly along the floor, and then it stopped, just a few feet away from her. It didn't make a sound. It didn't need to. Her mouth went dry. Her hands trembled as they reached out for her phone. But before she could even touch it, the air around her grew colder. The whispers returned, louder this time, rising in intensity. Her thoughts became muddled, her pulse quickening as the shadows pressed in from all sides. "You're not alone," a voice echoed behind her, and Emma turned, her body betraying her once more. There, just inches away, a figure stood. It was tall, nearly towering over her, its face hidden by a darkness that seemed to devour the light. Its features were distorted, as though it had been pulled from the very edges of the world, and its eyes, two deep, hollow pits, like black holes. They stared at her, unblinking, unfeeling. "It's waiting for you." The voice that wasn't her own murmured from the thing's lips. It was a harsh, guttural sound, something that scraped the very bones of reality. Emma stumbled backward, her legs trembling, her body unable to move fast enough. But as she reached the door to escape, the thing's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist in a grip that felt like cold steel. The shadows coiled around her, holding her in place, trapping her in the room. She could hear her own frantic breathing now, echoing in the dead air. "Don't turn around." The voice was no longer a whisper. It was a demand. "Don't." But it was too late. The shadow behind her pressed closer, its hand, no, its claws, sinking into her skin. The last thing she heard before the darkness took her was the same whisper, "Don't turn around." Emma's world collapsed into darkness, her body jerking violently as if her very soul was being torn from her. The pain that surged through her as the creature's claws dug into her wrist was unlike anything she had ever experienced. It wasn't physical. It was something deeper, something inside her. It felt as though the shadows were eating away at her, erasing her from existence, 1 inch at a time. Her body went numb, and she could no longer feel the ground beneath her feet. There was nothing but the oppressive blackness, the darkness that clung to her, swallowing everything. It was suffocating. She tried to scream, but no sound came. She tried to move, to fight, but her limbs betrayed her. The weight of the room, the weight of the shadow, pressed down on her, an unbearable force that seemed to exist beyond time, beyond reality. And then, as if someone had thrown a switch, everything stopped. The grip on her wrist loosened. The shadows receded. The coldness gone. The whispering faded, leaving only an eerie silence in its wake. Emma's chest heaved as she gasped for air, but the moment she exhaled, she realized something was wrong. She couldn't breathe the air fully. It felt like a void. Her lungs ached with the effort, but there was no relief. Her heart pounded in her chest like a drum, but it sounded muffled, distant. She opened her eyes, and the room she had been in only moments before was gone. There were no shadows, no darkness, no creature with eyes like black holes. Instead, Emma found herself standing in a different place entirely, one that felt all too familiar, but impossibly distorted. Her childhood home. The walls were cracked and peeling, the furniture decayed and dust-covered. The air was thick with the scent of rot. It was silent here, too silent. But there was something wrong. It wasn't just the decay. It wasn't just the silence. It was a feeling, the sensation that something was hidden just beneath the surface. Like there was an invisible weight pressing down on her, suffocating her. The feeling that she wasn't alone. Emma's hand instinctively reached for her phone. It wasn't there. Her heart skipped a beat. She looked around, frantic, trying to make sense of her surroundings, but nothing seemed right. The once warm and comforting rooms of her childhood home now looked like they had been abandoned for decades. She could feel the air shift as if something were watching her from just beyond her line of sight. Don't turn around. The voice, the same voice, but this time it was distant, echoing from the corners of her mind, whispered again, so soft she could barely hear it. The hair on the back of her neck stood up. It wasn't suggestion. It was a command, and it terrified her. Her breath caught in her throat. She didn't want to, but the pull of that voice, the command, was too strong. She slowly turned her head, unable to resist. And there, standing in the doorway of the old kitchen, was a shadow. It was no longer just a shadow. The figure had taken shape. It was no longer some vague form that played with the light, but a full silhouette, a man, or at least the shape of one. Tall, thin, its limbs unnaturally long, and its hands, no claws, curled at the tips like something that had crawled from the deepest pits of the earth. Its face was a void, an impenetrable blackness where eyes should have been. But there was something else, something in that darkness, a movement, something staring back at her. The creature tilted its head, and Emma felt a sudden, sharp pain in her chest. It was as if her heart was being squeezed from the inside. "You can't escape," the voice said, louder now, coming from the thing's mouth. She stumbled backward, terror flooding her senses. But no matter how fast she moved, the shadow stayed with her, its hollow presence following her every step. She couldn't escape. She couldn't move fast enough. The house seemed to stretch endlessly, the walls warping, the rooms shifting. And no matter which way she turned, the shadow was there, always there, watching. "Please." Emma gasped, clutching her chest. Her breath came in short, panicked bursts. "What do you want from me?" The shadow didn't respond with words. Instead, it stepped closer. Closer. Emma's vision blurred. Her legs weakened, and she collapsed to the floor. The darkness surrounding her deepened, swallowing everything in its path. She was no longer in her childhood home. She was somewhere else entirely, somewhere beyond reason, beyond understanding. The figure leaned down, and for the first time, Emma felt its presence, not just in her body, but in her mind. It wasn't just a thing standing in front of her. It was inside her thoughts. It was inside her fear. It spoke again, but this time it was different. This time, it was no longer just the echo of a distant whisper. It was loud. It was real. "You're mine." Emma's world spun wildly. Her surroundings blurred in and out of focus. She couldn't tell if she was in her room, her house, or some other place entirely. She couldn't feel her body anymore, and the shadow, that thing, it was everywhere. It was inside her, a constant pressure on her mind, pulling at her thoughts, eating away at her sanity. She closed her eyes, trying to shut it out, but when she opened them again, everything had changed. The walls were closing in. The floor was buckling. The ceiling was crashing down. The house was falling apart around her, disintegrating as if it had never existed. And still, the figure stood before her, unwavering. "Don't turn around." The voice whispered one final time, but Emma no longer had the strength to heed it. Her legs felt weak. Her hands trembled. She reached out for anything, for something to hold on to, but everything she touched was decaying, turning to dust in her fingers. And then the figure spoke again. Its voice was colder now, darker, as if it had gained strength from the terror that filled her. "You belong to me now." Emma couldn't fight it anymore. She couldn't understand it. The shadow was part of her, part of this place, part of whatever this was. She had turned around. She had looked, and now there was no turning back. Emma's heart raced with frantic desperation, but it was no use. The shadow had claimed her, its presence suffocating, smothering every last trace of her will. The air around her seemed to pulse with the darkness, a silent storm that swirled and twisted, sucking her into the void. It was impossible to breathe, impossible to think clearly. Her mind was scattered, fragmented, each thought breaking apart like shards of glass. The more she struggled, the tighter the shadow's grip became. Every inch of her body felt heavy, as though it was being pulled down by the weight of her own fear. The figure in front of her remained still, its hollow form unblinking, unmoving. But in that darkness, Emma could feel something shifting, an awareness, a hunger that made her stomach turn. The shadow wasn't just a thing, a mere presence. It was alive, and it was watching her. The whisper returned, louder this time, rising from the void like an oppressive storm. "You can't escape me. I am part of you now. You are mine." Her breath hitched as she tried to push herself up, but the shadows tugged at her, pulling her back down. She gritted her teeth, her hands clenching into fists as she fought against the weight. Her entire body screamed for release, for freedom, but there was no way out. No escape. "Don't look back." The voice was inside her head, echoing through every inch of her thoughts, the command impossible to ignore. She had learned the hard way what happened when she looked back. And yet, her eyes flickered. Something inside her, something primal, forced her to look again. Against every warning in her mind, against the terror clawing at her chest, she turned her gaze upward, locking eyes with the figure. But there was no face, only the void, only the empty abyss where eyes should be. The shadow was the darkness, and within that darkness, Emma felt herself becoming lost. She could no longer tell where she ended, and it began. It was consuming her from the inside, eroding her sense of self, her sense of reality. But there was something else, something buried deep within her. A thought, a question, a desperate plea. "Why me?" The shadow didn't answer right away. Instead, it moved closer, its presence filling the entire space around her. As it drew nearer, Emma's mind felt clearer, as though a part of her that had been hidden was finally being unearthed. Her fear, though still present, was overshadowed by a strange curiosity. What did it want from her? What was this thing, and why had it come into her life? The shadow seemed to pulse in response, its form writhing, almost as though it were listening to her thoughts. It came so close now that Emma could feel its cold breath against her skin, the temperature dropping with each passing second. "You think you have a choice?" The voice said, its tone shifting. "You have always been mine, from the very first moment." She recoiled, her body instinctively trying to pull away. But there was no escape. The shadow was everywhere now, inside her, around her, pressing against her. "I have been watching you for longer than you realize. Longer than you can comprehend. Your fear feeds me." Emma's mind spun as the words sank in. It wasn't just her room, her house. It was her. The shadow had always been here. It had always been with her, lurking just beneath the surface of her awareness, waiting for the right moment to claim her. Her heart ached as she pieced it together. Every nightmare, every strange feeling, every fleeting glimpse of something wrong. It wasn't just coincidence. It was this thing, this creature, shaping her life from the shadows. Its influence had always been there, drawing her closer, leading her into its grip, little by little. And now it was too late. The shadow leaned in, its form distorting, curling like smoke. For a moment, Emma felt a sudden rush of clarity. She could see it now, this dark being, not just as a monstrous entity, but as something tied to her very soul. It was a part of her, a reflection of her deepest fears, her darkest thoughts, her weaknesses, her vulnerabilities. It had always fed off of those. It was born from her, made stronger by her pain. "But why?" she asked, her voice shaky but filled with defiance. "Why now?" The shadow's form rippled, and for a fleeting moment, she thought she saw something, someone beneath it, a flicker of a face, an outline of a figure, and then it was gone. "You are the key," the shadow murmured, "and I am the lock. You have always been the one who could unlock it, the one who could release me. Your fear gave me form, but now it is your acceptance that will seal your fate." The air grew colder still. Emma's heart thudded painfully in her chest. She could feel the weight of the shadow pressing down on her, urging her to give in, to surrender, to become one with it. The thought of it made her skin crawl, but in that moment, she realized something. This thing, this creature, it was part of her, and it would never leave. But Emma still had one choice. The darkness pressed closer, and her mind was filled with images, memories of the past, the moments when she had first felt the presence of shadow, the way it had always been just out of sight, always there, always watching. The choice was clear, though it terrified her. Give in or fight back. Her chest tightened as she made her decision. No longer would she let this thing control her. No longer would she be a victim of its suffocating grip. She would fight, even if it meant losing everything, even if it meant facing the very darkness within herself. With a sudden burst of strength, Emma slammed her eyes shut. She turned her face toward the floor, refusing to look at the shadow, refusing to let it consume her. The whispers rose to a deafening roar in her ears, but she pushed through them, clenching her fists, fighting to hold on to her own sense of self. The darkness around her wavered. It flickered, like a broken light bulb struggling to stay on. The weight lifted just slightly, but that was all she needed. With a primal cry, Emma forced herself to her feet, ignoring the crushing pressure in her chest. She stepped forward, into the darkness, and then the world shattered. Emma's scream echoed in the darkness as she forced herself to move, each step a struggle against the overwhelming weight pressing against her, trying to keep her from moving forward. But she couldn't stop. She couldn't afford to. The world around her seemed to fracture, to break apart. The room she'd been in, the house she had known, seemed to melt, its walls dissolving into wisps of shadow that faded into nothing. Her vision blurred. Her body felt as if it was disintegrating, every molecule torn apart by the crushing force of the creature's presence. But she kept pushing. Fight back, she told herself. The whispering voice had quieted, but its presence was still there, constantly pressing against her mind, threatening to consume her thoughts. The shadow tried to regain control, reaching out with cold tendrils, trying to twist her back into submission. But Emma had made her choice. She wouldn't let it win. Her legs wobbled as she stumbled forward, her chest heaving with every ragged breath she took. She could feel the weight lifting slowly, the crushing darkness receding just enough for her to breathe, just enough for her to push through. But it wasn't over. Not yet. And then a voice, a new voice, cut through the silence. Emma. She froze. The voice was soft, almost loving, and yet something in it sent a cold shiver down her spine. The voice wasn't unfamiliar, but it sounded wrong, twisted, as if the words were being forced through a filter of pain and terror. Emma, I've been waiting for you. Her blood ran cold. She turned, her heart hammering against her ribs. But the room was empty. There was nothing there but the void, just endless, consuming darkness. Yet the voice continued, reverberating through the empty space, somehow all around her, inside her head. Come back. You belong here. You are mine. It was a shadow. It wasn't just a presence. It was more than that. It was a voice, a force, something that wanted her. It wasn't merely a thing from her nightmares. It had been waiting for her, following her, always close by, pulling at the strings of her fear, inching closer and closer until it was too late. The shadows around her began to shift again, swirling like a storm. She felt the temperature drop, the air becoming thick, suffocating, as if it was closing in on her from all sides. But Emma refused to back down. She focused on the one thing that had sustained her through the terror, the thought that this shadow, this thing, was not a part of her. It couldn't be. She would not let it define her. She was more than this. And then she remembered something that had happened long before the shadow had started haunting her. Her mother's words. Fear is the key, Emma, but it's also the lock. The only way out is through. Through. She understood now. Fear had always been the lock that kept the shadow bound to her, but her willingness to face it, to push through the darkness, was the only thing that could sever its hold. She wasn't just running from it. She needed to confront it, to accept the truth that it was a part of her, but that didn't mean she had to give in. With every ounce of strength she had left, Emma screamed into the darkness. "I am not yours." And the world around her shuddered. The shadow recoiled, its form flickering, pulsing erratically as though it were made of liquid, trying to regain control. Its presence seemed to falter, just for a moment. "No," the voice rasped, its tone now filled with anger, confusion. "You cannot do this. You cannot escape me." "I can," Emma retorted, her voice shaking but firm. "I will." The pressure, the weight, the suffocating darkness, all began to crumble, breaking apart in jagged fragments. Emma forced herself to move again, one step after another. The shadows tried to reach for her, but she pushed through them, every step breaking the illusion, tearing the creature's influence away from her. Suddenly, there was light. A pale, flickering light broke through the thick fog of shadows, illuminating her path. It was faint at first, like the distant glow of dawn, but it grew stronger with each moment. And as it did, the shadow's form continued to fade, dissolving into the light, unable to hold on to her any longer. Emma's heart was pounding in her chest, but now it was a relief. She had done it. She had faced the darkness and made it through. As the final vestiges of the shadow disappeared, Emma stood in the light, her body trembling with exhaustion. Her mind felt clear, no longer clouded by the oppressive weight of fear. It was as though the world around her had reset, returned to its natural state, no longer warped by the presence of the creature. The air was lighter, easier to breathe, but just as Emma allowed herself a moment of relief, she felt a strange tug in the back of her mind, a faint whisper. "You think this is over, Emma?" Her blood ran cold. The voice had returned, but it wasn't a shadow anymore. It was inside her head, like a thought that didn't belong. "You'll never be rid of me." Emma's hand flew to her head, pressing against her temple as if trying to block out the voice. Her breath quickened. Was it possible? Had she truly escaped? She closed her eyes, her mind racing. It was true. The shadow was gone, for now. But she knew one thing. The shadow hadn't been banished. It had merely been pushed back. It would find another way. It would find another crack, another doorway. Emma's breath hitched. There was no escaping it. Not completely. But there was something else, something she hadn't realized before. It wasn't just a shadow that she had to fight. It was her own fear. Her fear of what could happen, of what might be waiting for her. She looked around, the room now bathed in a cold, sterile light. There was no sign of the shadow, but the air still felt wrong, as if it hadn't quite returned to normal. One thing was certain. The battle was far from over. But Emma knew this now. She could fight. She could face the darkness. And as long as she kept pushing forward, there was still hope. Her journey, and the shadows that followed her, would never fully end. But she would never let them control her again. And as Emma stepped forward into the unknown, she couldn't help but wonder who or what was truly waiting for her in the darkness next time. Days passed since Emma had faced the shadow, or so she thought. The world around her seemed to reset, but something deep inside her told her that the fight was far from over. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting, watching. Her life had started to return to normal. The ordinary moments, drinking coffee, walking the streets, interacting with people, felt like a balm on her worn, frayed soul. She hadn't experienced any more strange occurrences, no more whispers in the dark, no more unsettling figures lurking just beyond her vision. But every night, when she closed her eyes, the shadows crept into her dreams. They whispered. They murmured of things she couldn't remember upon waking. But every time she opened her eyes, there was nothing. The shadow had retreated, or so she thought. It hadn't taken long for Emma to begin to believe that maybe it had been a bad dream, a twisted product of her stressed-out mind. Maybe it was all a figment of her imagination. But then came that night. It started the same way it always did. Her restlessness, the tossing and turning in her bed. Her body was exhausted, yet her mind raced. Every corner of her room seemed darker, colder than it should have been. She didn't want to look. She had already learned a painful lesson of what happened when she let curiosity take control. She was trying to ignore it, trying to remind herself that the nightmare was over, that the shadow was gone. But as she stared at the ceiling, something shifted in the room. The air grew colder. The silence became heavy. A noise echoed from the corner of the room. A faint shuffle. A whisper. She froze. Her heart pounded against her chest as she slowly turned her head, her breath catching in her throat. There it was. At first, it was subtle, just a flicker, a distortion at the edge of her vision. But then it grew clearer, taking form, materializing out of the darkness. It was the same thing, the same shadow. Its silhouette stretched, warped, as it seemed to grow taller, its limbs impossibly long and twisted. The air around it thickened as though the very room itself was warping, bending under its presence. Emma felt a rush of terror. She knew what would come next. She knew it would try to take her again. Her eyes filled with fear, but something else had emerged. A burning resolve. She had fought once before, and she had won. But this time, she wouldn't just fight to escape. This time, she would confront it once and for all. She stood up from her bed, her legs trembling, her breath shallow. The shadows reached out like long fingers, moving faster now, crawling along the walls and ceiling. Try to trap her. "Enough!" she whispered through clenched teeth. "I'm not afraid anymore." As soon as the words left her mouth, the shadows stilled, almost as if it had heard her, acknowledging her defiance. The dark figure cocked its head to the side, a deep, guttural sound rumbling from within its depths. The shadows seemed to ripple, to twist tighter around her. But Emma stepped forward, steadying herself against the fear that gnawed at her. "You don't control me. Not anymore." With those words, everything changed. The room around her distorted, like the world was being pulled in every direction. She could hear the whispers grow louder, the presence of the shadow consuming her. But she held her ground. The shadows tried to claw at her, but they weren't the same this time. They weren't made of fear anymore. They were made of something more ancient, something darker. She felt it, that deep, cold feeling running through her veins. The shadows closed in faster, but Emma didn't flinch. She closed her eyes and concentrated, reaching deep within herself. She remembered what she had learned from the first encounter. The shadow was connected to her fear, to her doubt, to her weaknesses. But it wasn't just a creature. It was a manifestation of her own mind, of her deepest insecurities. It fed on her terror and kept growing stronger with every ounce of fear she gave it. Her pulse thundered in her ears. The shadows coiled tighter around her, but she focused on the one thing she knew she had, her willpower. "Get away from me," she screamed. She didn't know where the strength came from, but suddenly the shadows stopped. The figure froze. The air was charged, vibrating with energy. Her heart pounded, her body trembling with the sheer effort of pushing the darkness away. But she kept going. In a burst of clarity, Emma remembered something she had read once. A theory about fear, that when you confront it head-on, when you no longer try to escape it, the fear loses its power. The shadows needed her fear to thrive, to stay alive. If she stopped being afraid, they would wither, and that's when she did it. She stopped being afraid. With one final, forceful thought, Emma willed the shadows to disappear. And for the first time, she felt the darkness recoil, as if something inside it had broken. The air shifted again, this time lighter. The weight lifted. The shadows screeched, fading away into nothingness. They evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a faint trace of cold air. Emma fell to her knees, breathing heavily. She opened her eyes and looked around. The room was normal again. No shadows, no creature, no whispers. The stillness that followed was overwhelming. And for a moment, Emma wasn't sure if it was truly gone, or if it was simply waiting for the right moment to strike again. But then, as she got up and glanced toward the window, she saw it, in the reflection of the glass. Just for a second, she saw the shadow, her own reflection, standing behind her. She spun around, but there was nothing there. Her heart skipped a beat as she backed away slowly. Her hand reached for the light switch. She flicked it on. The shadows receded completely. The figure was gone. But Emma knew one thing. This was only a temporary victory. The shadow might have retreated, but it wasn't truly gone. It would come back. It always did, because the shadow was a part of her. The darkness was something inside her that could never be erased, only faced. And as Emma stood in the room, the eerie silence wrapping around her, she couldn't shake the feeling that the next time, the battle would be even harder. The question wasn't whether the shadow would return. The question was whether she would be ready to face it again. Weeks passed since Emma had last faced a shadow. At least, that's what she convinced herself to believe. The terrifying encounter had left her shaken, yes, but the world around her seemed peaceful. Her nights were quieter. The oppressive weight of the shadows seemed to have lifted, leaving her with only a lingering unease that she couldn't quite shake. Life continued, and though Emma had never truly believed that the terror was over, she went on with her days, trying to convince herself that the darkness was a figment of her imagination. She went back to work, met up with friends, and spent time with her family, allowing herself to forget, even if just for a moment, the nightmare she had lived through. But Emma couldn't completely ignore the sensation that something wasn't right. There were moments when she would catch herself glancing over her shoulder, her eyes darting to corners of rooms, or staring uneasily at the edges of her reflection. She would stop dead in her tracks, as though she was on the verge of remembering something she didn't want to. Her pulse would quicken, her breath shallow, and she would silently curse herself for being so weak. No matter how hard she tried to forget, the shadow remained at the back of her mind, waiting, watching. It was one evening, while Emma was finishing dinner in her small, cozy apartment, that she saw it again. The evening had started like any other, nothing unusual. The warm golden light of the setting sun cast long shadows across the floor, the rhythmic ticking of the clock filling the silence. Emma stood in her kitchen, chopping vegetables for a quick stir-fry, her mind distant, absorbed in the mundane tasks of daily life. The sound of the knife on the cutting board was oddly soothing, a sharp contrast to the jittery feeling gnawing at her. The knife clattered to the counter, startling her out of her thoughts. She froze. Something was wrong. The air felt off. A pressure, subtle but growing, settled in her chest. It was as if the walls of her apartment were slowly creeping inward. Emma's hand gripped the counter, her fingertips turning white as a cold shiver ran down her spine. There was a feeling, a presence, in the room with her. No, it wasn't just a feeling. She knew it. Her heart pounded in her chest as she slowly turned her head toward the dim corner of her living room. The shadows there seemed darker than usual, thicker, more substantial. She had never noticed it before, but now she couldn't tear her eyes away. It was as though they were growing, expanding, creeping out of the corners, curling in on themselves. Her breath hitched, and then she saw it, a faint outline, a shape that wasn't quite right. The silhouette of a figure, tall and grotesque, standing motionless in the corner, just beyond the edge of the dim light. It wasn't a person. It wasn't human. It was something else. Her blood ran cold. It was the shadow. It was back. Emma's legs buckled beneath her, her knees giving way as the overwhelming weight of dread took over. Panic clawed at her throat, and for a moment, she was paralyzed. She didn't want to look. She didn't want to see it again, to acknowledge that it had returned. But she couldn't stop herself. Slowly, she turned her head. Slowly, she looked. There it was, in the corner, darker than any shadow should have been. Its edges blurred into walls, bending and flickering, as if it were a part of the very darkness itself. It didn't move, but the presence was undeniable. The air seemed to hum with its unnatural force, a quiet buzzing that gnawed at her bones. You thought you could escape me. The voice slithered into her mind, cold and heavy, like an ice-cold wind scraping her thoughts. Emma squeezed her eyes shut, shaking her head violently, trying to block it out. But it was no use. The shadow's presence had seeped into her mind again. It was inside her, now. You can't escape what you are. The voice was sharp, mocking. It felt like it was twisting inside her skull, digging into her very soul. She was suffocating, drowning in the intensity of its power, unable to breathe, unable to think clearly. Emma's hands clenched into fists, and she gritted her teeth, pushing back against the panic, against the overwhelming fear that threatened to consume her. "No," she whispered, her voice weak but defiant. "I'm not afraid of you anymore. I'm not afraid." For a moment, there was silence. Then, as though the shadow was laughing, a deep, guttural sound filled the room, distant, echoing, but unmistakable. The shadows began to stretch toward her, crawling slowly, deliberately. You still don't understand. It was a realization, a terrible one. The shadow wasn't just an entity, a separate being that existed outside of her. It was her. The darkness, the fear, the insecurities. It was all a part of her, a reflection of her own mind, a manifestation of everything she had buried, everything she had tried to ignore, every fear she had ever had, every doubt, every weakness. That was a shadow. It was a force that could only be kept at bay for so long. No matter how many times she faced it, no matter how many times she fought it would always come back. Because the shadow was inside her, Emma's heart pounded in her chest. But something had changed within her. The fear was still there. Yes, the terror of what this thing might do to her still clawed at her insides. But she was no longer running. No longer allowed herself to be swallowed whole by the darkness. "I know you now," she said, her voice firm, stronger than she had ever heard it before. "And you don't control me." The shadow seemed to recoil at her words, retreating, but just barely. There was an uncomfortable stillness in the air, as if the shadow was sizing her up, measuring her. "You think you can face me alone? You think you can conquer what's inside of you?" For a moment, Emma thought she heard the shadow laugh again. It was a laugh without warmth, without mercy, just a cold, chilling echo that reverberated in the air. But Emma didn't flinch. She stood her ground, fighting the urge to close her eyes, to look away. This time, she wouldn't let it win. The shadow may have been a part of her, but she was stronger than it realized. She would face it. She would break it down. She would survive. "I will make you face me. Forever." The voice rasped, and then the shadow surged forward, faster than ever before, engulfing the room, pressing it on her. But this time, Emma was ready. With everything she had, she stepped forward into the dark. The world around Emma seemed to crack and bend as the shadow surged forward, its presence overwhelming and suffocating. The walls of her apartment twisted like paper, the air heavy with a darkness that made it hard to breathe, to think. Emma's pulse raced in her ears, drowning out everything but the chilling sensation of the shadow closing in. She could feel the weight of it pressing against her chest, the suffocating pull that threatened to drag her into the abyss. But she didn't back down. The shadow didn't just loom in front of her. It was inside her, now. It had always been there, just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to pounce. A manifestation of her fears, her guilt, the darkest part of herself that she had tried to ignore. She could no longer separate herself from it. It was her. But even as she realized that, something deep within her told her she wasn't powerless. She had fought it once before, and she would fight it again. With trembling hands, Emma reached into her pocket and gripped the small pendant her mother had given her long ago. The metal was cold against her fingers, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to remember her mother's words. "Fear is not a prison, Emma. It's a key. The lock is within you. You decide if you open it." Her mother had always known, even when Emma hadn't. Fear could only control her if she let it. The shadow could only exist if she allowed it to. She had to stop running from it. The shadow reached out like a tidal wave, its tendrils of darkness swirling toward her, aiming to engulf her. She felt the pressure again, the suffocating weight of it. But this time, she didn't freeze. This time, she fought. "I am not afraid of you," she whispered, her voice steady, despite the terror churning in her chest. The words felt like a lifeline, each syllable a defiance against the darkness that threatened to swallow her whole. The shadow paused, its form writhing, flickering like a flame caught in the wind. It let out a sound, low, guttural, almost like a growl, as if it were frustrated by her resistance. "You can't escape me," the voice rumbled, its coldness creeping into her mind. "You're mine. You always have been." Emma closed her eyes, shaking her head. "No, I'm not yours." The shadow screamed, a sound like glass shattering, before it surged forward again. But this time, Emma stood her ground, her body steady. The darkness pressed into her, but she felt a flicker of something else, something deep inside her, a spark that was stronger than the fear. She opened her eyes. The room around her was no longer just dark. There were cracks, small at first, but they were spreading, like fissures in the walls of her own mind. Light bled to the cracks, a soft, warm glow, fighting back the suffocating blackness. The shadow recoiled, its form flickering as though it could no longer hold its shape in the face of the light. "What are you doing?" the shadow hissed. You cannot. But Emma didn't stop. The pendant in her hand began to glow brighter, a steady light that pushed back the darkness, illuminating the room, driving the shadows back into the corners. "I am not your prisoner," Emma said, each word heavier than the last, grounded in something deeper than fear. "I'm free." The room began to shift, warping as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling. The darkness seemed to fight back, clawing at the walls, but Emma could feel it weakening. It was no longer holding on to her. The light from her pendant burned brighter, like a beacon, and the shadow screamed, its form shattering into wisps of black smoke, dissipating into the air. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, Emma felt the shadow's grip loosen completely. But the relief was short-lived. Just as the last remnants of darkness began to vanish, a final, guttural voice echoed in her head. "This is not over. You cannot escape what is inside you." Emma's chest tightened, and for a split second, she felt a flash of doubt. Could she ever truly be free of the shadow? Would it always come back, lurking in the corners of her mind, waiting to consume her again? But she refused to listen. She couldn't let it win. She had already faced it once. She had already learned that the darkness was hers. But so was the light. She clenched her fist around the pendant and whispered, more firmly now, "I control this." The light from the pendant flared again, bright and powerful, filling the room with warmth that pushed the darkness to the edges. The shadow struggled one last time, but it was fading, receding further into corners of the room, its whispers dying away. And then it was gone. Emma stood there in the silence, breathing heavily, her body still trembling from a battle. Her mind buzzed with the remnants of the encounter, but the suffocating presence of the shadow had disappeared. She was alone in her apartment, alone with herself for the first time in what felt like forever. The quiet, steady pulse of her own heartbeat was the only sound she could hear. But something had changed. Emma wasn't the same person she had been when this all started. The darkness had been a part of her, but she had learned that it didn't define her. She had faced it, fought it, and survived. And now, in its absence, she felt a sense of clarity, of strength she hadn't known she had. The fear still lingered like a distant echo, but it was no longer the thing that ruled her. Emma walked to the window and looked outside, the city lights flickering in the distance, and for the first time in so long, she allowed herself to breathe. She wasn't running. She wasn't hiding. She was free. But as the night settled in, a final thought crossed her mind, one that sent a shiver down her spine. What happens when the darkness finally leaves? It was an unsettling thought, but Emma knew one thing for sure. No matter what came next, she was ready to face it. And this time, she would never let the shadow win. Emma woke up the next morning to the soft rays of sunlight streaming through the blinds, casting gentle patterns across the floor. The weight that had once hung over her was gone, leaving behind a sense of calm she hadn't felt in what felt like a lifetime. She sat up in bed, her head a little heavier than usual, but she didn't feel afraid. The shadow, that presence that had haunted her for so long, was no longer there, or so she thought. The night had passed uneventfully, and for the first time, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, it was over. Maybe the darkness had been vanquished for good. As she stood up and stretched, a slight movement in the corner of her eye caught her attention. At first, she thought it was just the shadows shifting in the early morning light. But then it happened again, flickering out of place, like something out of the corner of her vision was wrong. Emma stopped, her pulse quickening for just a moment. She swallowed the rising panic, telling herself it was nothing, just a trick of the light. But deep down, the unease that had lingered ever since the encounter with the shadow never fully left her. It was as if something inside her had shifted, like a piece of a puzzle clicking into place. Something dangerous, and now she was aware of it. A sensation, like a faint pulse of energy, lingered under her skin, as if the battle wasn't truly over. She shook her head and went about her morning routine, trying to push the feeling aside. Her apartment was still the same, quiet, familiar. Nothing seemed out of place. She brewed some coffee, flicked through her phone, checked her messages, and tried to go about her day. But even as she did, the sensation didn't leave her. It was subtle, like a whisper just on the edge of her hearing. Too faint to understand, but there. She couldn't tell if it was her own paranoia or something more, something deeper. Later that evening, as Emma settled into her couch to watch a movie, she began to notice how still the apartment had become. The hum of the refrigerator, the faint tick-tock of the clock, and the distant sounds of the city were now the only sounds breaking the silence. She felt as though she was waiting for something, a sense of anticipation thick in the air, but she couldn't tell what for. Then it happened, a faint tap. It came from the far side of the room, soft, almost imperceptible, like a finger tapping against wood. At first, Emma tried to dismiss it. Just the house settling, she thought. But then came another tap, louder this time, and another, a rhythmic pattern. Her heart began to race, the familiar cold hand of fear creeping up her spine. The shadows seemed to shift around her, growing heavier, pressing in. She turned her head quickly to look, but there was nothing there. Her breath came in shallow bursts, her hand shaking as she reached for the remote to turn on the lights. Nothing. The room remained as it always had been, normal. The tapping stopped. But Emma's eyes darted to a reflection in the window, her own face staring back at her, pale and tense. Something seemed off. It was as if the glass had become a mirror, showing a version of her that didn't quite look right. The lights flickered. For a brief, terrifying moment, the reflection in the glass changed. Her face contorted in an expression of sheer horror, as though something dark had taken over her very being. It was as if her reflection was not hers at all, but a twisted version of it. The tap started again, louder, more persistent. Her breath caught in her throat as she finally stood up, slowly inching toward the window, feeling every muscle in her body tense. She reached out to touch the glass, her fingers brushing lightly against the cold surface. Tap, tap, tap. The lights flickered once again, and Emma's reflection smiled back at her, a wide, knowing smile that didn't belong to her. The reflection in the window reached up, slowly lifting one finger to its lips, signaling for Emma to be silent. A sense of pure dread filled her chest. This was no longer just a shadow. This wasn't something she could push away anymore. She wasn't sure if it was a part of her mind breaking, or if something more sinister was taking root. The question ran through her mind like a hammer, striking metal. What if the shadow didn't leave? The tapping stopped, but Emma didn't feel any sense of relief. Instead, she felt an overwhelming presence, the weight of something watching her. Her mind raced. She had done everything she could. She had faced the shadow. She had confronted the darkness. She had let the light in. Had it really worked? Had she actually banished it? Or had she merely contained it? As the seconds dragged on in silence, the room seemed to pulse with a dark, growing energy. And then, without warning, the lights went out. The apartment was plunged into darkness. A low, deep growl rumbled from the farthest corner of the room, the unmistakable sound of something moving, shifting, becoming something else. Emma froze in terror, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't see it, but she felt it. The air was thick, oppressive, like a vacuum had formed around her, sucking away the very light, the very air she was breathing. Suddenly, a whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. "I am always here, Emma." The voice sent a sharp jolt of panic through her. It wasn't the shadow's voice. It was hers. Her reflection in the window shifted again. It wasn't smiling anymore. The face that stared back at her was twisted in agony, the eyes wide and filled with terror. And then something moved in the darkness, something behind her, something that didn't belong. Emma spun around, gasping for breath, but when she did, there was nothing but the oppressive, choking silence. But she could feel it, the shadow. It was in the room with her, right behind her, waiting, watching. Her mind screamed for her to leave, to run, but her body refused to move. The darkness had become a part of her. She could no longer tell if it was an external force or if it was something buried deep within her, something she could never escape. The shadow was always inside her. In that moment, Emma realized a chilling truth. She would never be rid of the shadow. It wasn't something that could be defeated or even escaped. The shadow was her. It was a part of her, and she would spend her life running from it, only to find it waiting for her at every turn. And as the last flicker of light from the window faded, Emma knew that her battle was far from over. The silence was unbearable. Emma stood motionless in the center of the room, every nerve on high alert. The darkness surrounding her felt like it was breathing, pressing in on her from all sides. The cold air seemed to close in around her, and every shadow stretched unnaturally, like claws waiting to strike. She had been here before, trapped in the suffocating grip of fear, her mind slowly unraveling as the shadow made its presence known. But this time, something was different. It wasn't just the fear that gripped her. There was an undercurrent of something more, an overwhelming feeling of being watched. She could feel its eyes on her, even though there was no physical form to see. She wasn't alone, not in the way she had once thought. She wasn't facing an external force anymore. The shadow had merged with her, become something that lived inside her, a part of her very soul. She couldn't fight it. She didn't even know if she wanted to fight it anymore. As she stood there in the pitch black, a creeping realization began to settle in her chest. The shadow was no longer something outside of her, but presence inside her thoughts. The longer she stood in the dark, the more she felt it tightening its grip. It wasn't just terror, it was control. The shadow was patient, waiting, weaving its influence deeper into the fabric of her being. "You can't escape me, Emma." The words echoed in her mind, harsh, menacing. They weren't spoken out loud, but they reverberated in the very air around her, as if the darkness itself was speaking. She tried to force her eyes to adjust to the darkness, but it felt like the longer she waited, the less she could see. The night stretched on forever. Emma's heart began to race again, that cold sensation creeping up her spine. She had to move. She had to do something. She couldn't stay in the dark forever. But as she took one step forward, a hand, not her own, reached out from the shadows. It brushed lightly against her cheek, cold as ice, like it was somehow in tune with the shadows around her, with the very darkness that had once sought to consume her. She gasped and recoiled, stepping back. But the hand wasn't real. It wasn't physical. It was just another part of the shadow's hold over her, its invisible fingers slipping into her thoughts, holding her still. It's already too late. The voice in her head was sharper this time, more real. It felt like a part of her own consciousness was being twisted, reshaped by the shadow's power. "No," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. "No, I won't let you control me." But as soon as the words left her mouth, she realized they weren't just a defense. They were a plea, a desperate cry to hold on to whatever she had left, to resist the pull of the darkness that was taking her over. But the words felt hollow now, almost like a confession. The shadow was no longer a stranger. It was her. It had become so ingrained in her mind that she no longer knew where she ended and it began. Her reflection flashed in her mind, that twisted version of herself, the one that smiled back at her, its eyes wide in terror. She had tried to deny it, but now the truth was undeniable. The reflection had been a warning. The shadow wasn't just something that came and went. It had been inside her all along. "You will never be free." The whisper slithered through her mind, and Emma felt the last thread of her resolve snap. The darkness wasn't just something she could fight off. It was her constant companion. And every time she thought she had escaped it, it returned, lurking in the corners of her thoughts, always waiting. She collapsed to her knees, her hands pressed against her temples, trying to block out the thoughts, the whispering, the growing sense of dread. She needed to escape, but there was nowhere to run. The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing in around her. The darkness was suffocating. The air was thick with the smell of stale fear. And then she heard it again, the tapping, soft, rhythmic, like nails scratching against wood. This time, it was coming from all around her, in every corner of the room, in the very fabric of the darkness itself. Tap, tap, tap. Her eyes shot open, wide with panic. But there was nothing there. No form, no figure, only the endless black. It was a shadow. The tapping wasn't an outside noise. It was her. The shadow was her. And then, with one final tap, the darkness burst. The room seemed to collapse in on itself, twisting, warping. The walls grew tall and narrow, stretching upward into an endless void. The light that had once flickered now twisted, coiling into impossible shapes, filling the room with the oppressive feeling of something watching. Emma couldn't breathe. The shadow was inside her, and she realized the truth now. There was no escape, no final confrontation, no happy ending. The shadow had already claimed her soul, and in return it had become her. The tapping grew louder now, resonating in her skull, a beat she could not outrun. The walls around her were no longer just walls. They were her mind, crumbling apart, folding into the endless abyss of terror. You cannot defeat me. The voice wasn't just a whisper now, it was a roar, a deafening scream inside her head. And then she understood this wasn't the end of the story. The shadow didn't want to destroy her. It wanted to consume her, yes, but it also wanted to become her, to live in her, to control her every move, every breath. Emma looked into the dark void before her. There was no way out, no way to escape what had already taken hold of her. No final stand. She had let it in, and now it was too late to turn back. Her breath came in shallow bursts. There was nothing left but the shadow and her. And in the endless void, one thing was certain. The darkness would never leave. It would never let go. Emma's world was no longer hers to control. The darkness had seeped into every crack of her mind, twisting and warping the edges of reality, as if she were living in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. She wasn't sure if the world around her was real anymore, or if it was just a figment of her fading sanity. The tapping continued. It was relentless, rhythmic, pulsing in time with the thumping of her own heart. Tap, tap, tap. The sound seemed to echo through the apartment, reverberating off the walls, filling every corner of her mind. The shadow was there not as a separate entity, but as a part of her, one and the same. She could feel it moving beneath her skin, stretching to the blood in her veins, threading its fingers into her thoughts. The reflection that had once terrified her now felt like the truth. Her own face in the mirror was no longer familiar. It was hollow, empty, her eyes too wide, too vacant. She barely recognized the person staring back at her. And yet, in the depths of that reflection, she saw something else. Something dark, something that shouldn't have been there, but was. Her fingers trembled as they reached out to touch the glass. The instant her skin met the cool surface, her reflection smiled, a twisted, malevolent grin that was not her own. "It's you, Emma. You've always been mine." The words slammed into her mind, like a heavy punch to the gut. The shadow was speaking again, but this time it wasn't just a voice. It was her own thoughts, her own feelings twisted into something unnatural. It had become her. There was no separating them anymore. They were intertwined, fused together in ways she could never undo. The tapping grew louder, and suddenly she wasn't alone in the apartment. The shadows moved in the corners, shifting like living things, crawling along the walls, slithering across the floor. They were pulling her in, drawing her deeper into the dark hole of her own mind. She could feel their fingers brushing against her skin, their cold touch sending shivers down her spine. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The shadows surrounded her, coiling and twisting around her legs, climbing up her arms. They weren't just shadows anymore. They were part of her, too, a part of her that she couldn't escape. She stumbled backward, gasping for air, her heart racing in panic. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in on her. The air was thick with something she couldn't place, something suffocating and oppressive. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. "You can't escape me, Emma." The voice echoed through her mind again, sharp and cold. She clutched her head, trying to block out the words, but they came at her from all sides, like 1,000 whispers, 1,000 voices, all telling her the same thing. "You're mine. You've always been mine." Emma's hands went to her neck, instinctively trying to choke down the rising panic. try to stop the suffocating pressure in her chest. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't stop the feeling. She couldn't stop the darkness that was swallowing her whole. The shadows didn't just surround her anymore. They were inside her. They were twisting through her thoughts, breaking apart the very fabric of her reality. The air itself seemed to grow heavier, thicker, like the world was becoming a distorted reflection of itself. "You'll never escape," the shadow whispered again, its voice now a constant buzz in her mind, a hum she couldn't shake. "You're not strong enough. You can't fight me." She looked around the apartment, her apartment, but it wasn't the same. The walls were warped, bending in impossible angles. The floor was slick with a darkness that seemed to pulse beneath her feet. Nothing was solid. Everything was fluid, shifting, like the very fabric of her reality was breaking apart. And then, for a moment, everything froze. The tapping stopped. The shadows paused. There was a strange, eerie stillness in the air, like the world was holding its breath. Emma stood, frozen, her heart racing in her chest, her mind spinning. "Look at me, Emma." The voice wasn't in her head this time. It was real, right behind her. She turned slowly, her breath caught in her throat, and there it was, the thing she had been avoiding, the thing she had tried to escape, the shadow. It was no longer a vague, shifting form. It was solid now. It stood before her, taller than she remembered, its form dark and twisted, made of pure blackness. It wasn't just in the corners anymore. It was right there in front of her, its presence overwhelming and suffocating. It had her, and yet, despite the terror that gripped her, Emma felt something else, a strange, dark curiosity. Was this really the end? Or was this something new? Something she could never have understood before? "I've always been a part of you, Emma. You just never realized it. You can't fight me anymore. You've been fighting yourself." The voice was deep and dark, reverberating in her bones. It was true. She had been running from this all along, running from the parts of herself she didn't want to face. The fear, the anger, the darkness, all of it had been inside her. The shadow was just a reflection of her own fears, her own insecurities. The shadow stepped closer. She could feel its coldness, the icy tendrils wrapping around her, pulling her deeper into its grip. It was an embrace, but not a comforting one. It was a suffocating one, an all-consuming one. "You're mine now, Emma." Her breath came in quick, shallow bursts, her vision spinning as the shadow surrounded her, pulling her into its depths. She couldn't see anymore. She couldn't hear anything but the thumping of her own heartbeat. And then, finally, the world went silent. But as the darkness closed on her, something strange happened. A faint light flickered in the distance, barely noticeable, but there, it wasn't much. Just a soft glow in the farthest corner of her mind, a light fighting against the overwhelming dark. And in that light, a question began to form. Had she truly lost everything? Emma's world was no longer the one she once knew. The shadows had consumed her, wrapped themselves around her thoughts, woven themselves into the very fabric of her being. She was no longer certain what was real, and what was just a distorted creation of the darkness within her. The blackness pressed in, choking out every ounce of light and hope she had once clung to. She was lost, but in the depths of that overwhelming void, a spark of something flickered. It was faint, so faint that Emma wasn't sure if it was real or just a figment of her mind, but it was there, a soft, warm glow, like a distant star in an otherwise endless night. It was a light in the farthest corner of her mind, the only thing that hadn't been swallowed by the consuming dark. For a moment, Emma was suspended between two worlds. The shadow, her own reflection in its twisted form, held her in its grasp, cold and unyielding. The darkness pulsed around her, the whispers of the shadow growing louder, suffocating her thoughts. But the light remained. It was as though it had been waiting for her, as if it had always been there, hidden beneath the shadow. "What is that?" Emma thought, desperate to hold on to it. The shadow shifted, a deep rumbling sound vibrating through the air. It loomed over her, its form warping, its dark tendrils reaching for her. But Emma didn't move. She couldn't. Not yet. "You cannot fight me," the shadow hissed. "I have already won." Emma's heart raced in her chest. The words were chilling, but the flicker of light inside her burned with a quiet defiance. This wasn't over. It couldn't be. Suddenly, the light grew brighter. It pulsed once, twice, a steady rhythm. It was pushing against the shadow. Emma could feel it, could sense it within herself. The shadow trembled, momentarily faltering, but just for an instant, the light was fighting back. In the quiet of her mind, Emma heard something soft, faint but unmistakable. A voice, her own voice. "You are not me." The words rang in her ears, not with fear, but with a quiet strength. Emma blinked, staring into the abyss that surrounded her. The shadows were pulling at her, trying to drag her back into the depths, but the light was stronger now. It was no longer just a distant flicker. It was growing, swelling, filling the corners of her mind, shoving the darkness back inch by inch. "You are not me," the words repeated, each time louder, more confident. Emma's mind screamed with the realization that the shadow was not a part of her. It was not something she had to accept. She could fight back. She had been fighting for so long, convinced she was helpless, convinced that the shadow had taken everything from her. But it hadn't. Not yet. The light inside her was still there. It always had been. She took a deep breath, feeling the air return to her lungs, feeling the pressure in her chest ease. She closed her eyes, focusing on the warmth, the gentle glow of light, and let it spread throughout her body. Her fingers tingled, as if waking from a long, cold slumber. Her heartbeat steadied, each pulse pushing against the darkness. The shadow recoiled. No, the voice came again, but now it was weaker, distant. "You are mine." "No," Emma whispered aloud, her voice trembling with power she didn't even know she had. "You never were." And then, with a surge of clarity, the light within her exploded. It was bright, blinding. It flooded the darkened room, erasing the shadows, pushing them away like a tidal wave. Emma felt the heat of it, the purity of it, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt free. The shadow screamed. The darkness twisted and writhed, but it couldn't hold on anymore. The light burned through it, banishing it from every corner of her mind. The oppressive weight lifted, leaving her breathless but filled with a strange sense of relief. Emma opened her eyes. She was standing in her apartment again, the sunlight streaming to the window, bathing the room in warmth. The shadows no longer pressing on her, no longer threatened to swallow her. The walls were just walls again. The floor was solid beneath her feet. Her heart still raced in her chest, but it wasn't from fear. It was from the fight, from the victory. She had won. But as she took a shaky step forward, she heard something soft, almost imperceptible. A tap, 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 tap. The air froze in her lungs. She turned her head toward the sound, her pulse quickening again. No, not again. Not this time. There, in the corner of the room, where the shadows still lingered, something moved. A figure, a shape. She could barely make it out, but it was there, watching her, its eyes gleaming with that same malevolent hunger. Her heart sank. No, the shadow hadn't truly left. Not completely. The tapping continued, more insistent now. Closer. Emma's mind raced. She had fought. She had won. Hadn't she? She turned her back to the figure, not wanting to face it, but knowing she had no choice. She had to face the truth. The shadow was always with her, a part of her, a piece of her soul that could never be fully erased. It had left her, but it had also become her. And now it was waiting, watching. The tapping stopped. Silence. Emma's breath hitched, her eyes wide. She didn't dare turn around. It's not over. It's never over. The words drifted through her mind, whispered as though from the very shadow itself. But it didn't matter. Not anymore. Emma had learned that she could live with it. She had faced it, fought it, and survived. No matter how many times it came back, she would be ready. Emma couldn't move. Her body was frozen, locked in place by a force far stronger than fear. The silence in the room was suffocating, as if the air itself had become too thick to breathe. Every muscle in her body screamed for release, but her mind was caught in a web of terror, tangled in the growing presence of the figure behind her. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was relentless, like a clock counting down the final moments of her sanity. It had returned. The shadow, the thing she thought she had banished, was back. Slowly, as though moving against an invisible barrier, Emma turned. The air was thick with the weight of the moment, heavy and suffocating. Her eyes scanned the room, the corner, the figure. There it was, standing in the shadows, its form indistinct, shifting, like smoke that refused to solidify. It didn't make a sound, but she could feel it, like a presence pressing in on her, watching her with a hunger she couldn't escape. It wasn't just any shadow. It was the shadow, the one she had battled so many times, the one that had become so much more than a simple fear. It was her fear, her darkness, her regret, her past. Her heart raced, and she staggered backward, desperate to escape. No, no, no. She'd already fought it off once. She'd faced it head-on and won. It couldn't be back. It couldn't. But the figure stepped forward, its form becoming more solid, more defined. Its eyes gleamed like two dark holes, endless and empty. It reached out a hand, or perhaps it was more like a tendril, extending from the blackness, brushing against the edge of the room, sending a wave of cold through her body. Tap! The sound echoed in her skull. The shadows whisper. The voice. It was more than a whisper now. It was real. It wasn't inside her mind. It was coming from the room, coming from the air itself. It was alive. I never left, Emma. You can't escape me. Emma's breath caught in her throat. The words filled her ears. But this time they didn't just invade her thoughts. They commanded her, pulling her back to the memories she tried to bury, pulling her into the darkness she had tried so desperately to outrun. Her eyes darted around, frantic, but there was nowhere to hide. The shadows were all around her now. The walls, the floor, the ceiling. They were alive, alive with the pulse of the shadow, the constant tapping, the steady rhythm of her own heart, broken and hollow. You can never escape me. You were never meant to. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The figure, the shadow, had consumed her. She felt its coldness closing in around her, tightening its grip. There was no way out. The truth hit her all at once, like a cold wave crashing over her. The shadow wasn't a thing she could banish or fight. It was a part of her. It had always been. It was born of her fears, her regrets, her past mistakes. It was everything she had pushed away for so long, and now it had returned. But why? Because I am you, Emma, and you are me. The words didn't just come from the figure. They came from within her. It was inside her thoughts now, weaving itself into the very fabric of her mind, melding with her consciousness. She felt it like 1,000 icy fingers caressing her skin, wrapping around her thoughts, twisting them, altering them. She couldn't escape. But she realized something as the darkness closed around her, smothering her once more. She had never truly escaped before, had she? Even when she thought she had defeated the shadow, when she felt the light pulse through her and banish it, it never really left. Emma closed her eyes, the weight of the realization pressing down on her chest. She had been wrong all this time. It wasn't about defeating the shadow. It wasn't about banishing it from her life. The shadow was a part of her, a reflection of everything she feared and resented about herself. She couldn't fight it. Not like this. Not forever. It wasn't about fighting at all. Embrace me, the shadow whispered again, softer this time. You can't escape what's already inside you. You are me. Emma's breath shuddered as she stared into the dark void of the room, her heart racing. She was trapped, but in that moment, a strange, twisted sense of peace washed over her. She was caught in the cycle of fear, the endless loop she could never break free from. But maybe that was the key. Maybe the answer wasn't to run anymore. Maybe the answer was to accept it. No, she whispered, her voice shaking. I'm not you. But the shadow laughed, a low, guttural sound that seemed to echo through every corner of her mind, twisting everything she knew, every part of herself. You always were. Her thoughts began to blur again, like the lines between reality and the shadow were becoming less distinct. Was she truly seeing what was in front of her, or was it all just part of the shadow's twisted game? Was she even still in her apartment, or was she lost in her own mind, imprisoned by her own fears? The figure reached out again, this time touching her shoulder. She gasped, but the sensation wasn't cold anymore. It was warm, familiar, like the embrace of something that had always been with her. She wanted to pull away, to run, but her body was paralyzed. "You've always known me. We've always been together." The words whispered over and over, like a mantra, until Emma's head spun. Her vision blurred, her thoughts clouded, and for the first time since the shadow had come into her life, she understood the truth. The shadow had never been something outside of her. It wasn't a force that could be defeated or banished. It had always been her. Her mind was unraveling, but in the chaos, she saw something else. The faintest flicker of light, the same light that had burned so brightly before, the one she had thought she lost. It was still there, faint but steady, tucked away in the deepest corners of her soul. "I can't lose this," she thought. "I won't let you take me completely." And for the first time in a long time, Emma fought back, not against the shadow, but against the part of her that had allowed it to define her. She had been running from it, but the fight had never been about running. It had always been about understanding it, accepting it. With every ounce of strength she had left, Emma reached for the light inside her, the flickering warmth that had never abandoned her, no matter how dark it had gotten. She let the light surge through her, flooding every corner of her soul, pushing the shadow back. But as the darkness began to retreat, something new happened. The shadow didn't vanish completely. It didn't fade into nothingness. It remained a part of her, an echo in the distance. But it wasn't in control anymore. Emma stood alone in the room, the silence pressing around her. The tapping had stopped. The figure was gone. The light burned brighter now. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Emma finally understood. She wasn't fighting the shadow anymore. She had learned to live with it. The room was quiet. Still, the kind of quiet that had a weight to it, a heaviness that wrapped itself around her like an invisible shroud. Emma stood there, her heart still pounding in her chest, but she no longer felt the suffocating pull of the shadow. The darkness had receded, for now. The light inside her flickered steadily, a small beacon in the vast emptiness that surrounded her. She let out a slow breath, steadying herself, her thoughts swirling. She had won, hadn't she? She had faced her fears, embraced the darkness within her, and found a way to coexist with it. That had to be enough, right? But a part of her remained unsettled. The shadow hadn't been completely destroyed. It hadn't disappeared. It was still there, lurking in the depths of her mind, like a cold breath at the back of her neck, waiting for the right moment to return. Emma shook her head, trying to push the thoughts away. She couldn't afford to dwell on it. Not now. She had to move forward, had to find a way to live her life, even with the shadow at the edges of her consciousness. The world outside her apartment felt oddly distant. The familiar hum of the city, the distant chatter of people, all seemed like echoes in a world she no longer fully belonged to. Was she the same person she had been before the shadow had come into her life? Was she even the same person before she had learned to confront her own darkness? A knock at the door broke her from her thoughts. It was sharp, quick, as if whoever was on the other side knew exactly what they wanted. Emma flinched, her heartbeat quickening once more. The shadow. She could almost feel it stirring again inside her, as if it were feeding off her anxiety. But she pushed the sensation aside. It wasn't a shadow. It couldn't be. Not this time. She stepped cautiously toward the door, each movement deliberate. As her hand wrapped around the cold metal of the doorknob, her thoughts spiraled. Who could it be? What did they want? She hadn't spoken to anyone in days, not since everything happened. Taking a deep breath, she opened the door, and there stood a man she didn't recognize. His appearance was ordinary, casual clothes, a plain brown jacket, dark jeans. But there was something about him, something in the way he looked at her, that made her stomach tighten. His eyes were dark, almost black, and they seemed to pierce through her, searching, digging into something deep within her. "Can I help you?" Emma asked, her voice steady but guarded. She could feel her pulse pounding in her neck, the sensation of the shadow's presence threatening to return, but she forced herself to stand tall. She would not let it control her again. The man didn't smile. He didn't even acknowledge the typical pleasantries. Instead, his eyes remained locked on hers, his gaze intense. "I know what you've been through," he said, his voice low but clear. "I know what you've seen." Emma's heart skipped a beat, her throat tightening. "How do you know that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, but she couldn't help herself. The shadow stirred inside her again, its cold fingers brushing against her mind. The man took a slow step forward, but not too close. He seemed to respect the space between them, but the feeling that he was not a stranger, like he had been waiting for this moment, hung in the air. His eyes softened just slightly. "The shadow," he said, and his tone was almost like a warning. "It's not gone. You know that, don't you?" Emma's breath caught in her chest. How could he possibly know that? "I've seen it before," the man continued, his voice steady. "I've seen the way it twists your mind, makes you question everything. But you're not alone in this, Emma. Not anymore." Her hand gripped the door tighter, her knuckles turning white. She had been so sure that she had faced a shadow, that she had understood it, that she had finally taken control of it. But hearing the stranger's words brought the fear rushing back, stronger than ever. "What do you mean I'm not alone?" she asked, her voice trembling, but she refused to show it. She had faced a shadow before. She could face it again. The man studied her for a moment, as if weighing something in his mind. Then he took a step back, his eyes scanning the hallway behind him before he spoke again. "You're not the only one the shadow is after. There are others, people who have seen it, felt it, experienced it. The shadow isn't just a personal nightmare. It's part of something much bigger, something far more dangerous than you realize." Emma's pulse quickened. The weight of his words sank deep into her chest, pressing down on her like a physical force. She had always felt like the shadow was her own burden, a personal demon she had to conquer. But now, what did he mean by bigger? "The shadow feeds on fear, on regret, on the darkness within us," the man continued. "And it seeks out those who are vulnerable. It has been watching you, Emma. It has been waiting." Emma's mind raced. Waiting? Waiting for what? The man's gaze softened again, but it was a fleeting expression. There was something almost urgent in his voice now. "You're not just fighting it for yourself. You're fighting it for all of us. People like you. People who've seen the truth and now need to fight it." Emma's head spun. She wanted to ask so many questions, but the words wouldn't come. The shadow, the thing she had thought she had overcome, was still out there, still hunting her. But now, it was a threat to others? She wanted to slam the door in the man's face, to run and hide, to forget all of this and pretend it hadn't happened. But a part of her, the part that had confronted her deepest fears, the part that had survived the darkness, knew she couldn't. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice shaking, her mind a whirlwind. The man didn't answer at first. He only took one more step backward, his eyes still locked on hers. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm the one who has been watching the shadows, and I've been waiting for you, Emma." The man's words echoed in Emma's ears long after he left her doorstep. "I've been waiting for you." His shadow, like a distant but ever-present threat, seemed to follow her even now, lurking just beneath the surface. Emma closed the door slowly, her fingers trembling as they grazed the cold, smooth wood. She stood there for a moment, her mind racing with questions. Who was he? Why had he come now, after everything? After all she had endured? The apartment felt unnervingly quiet again, the silence pressing down on her like a heavy blanket. The shadow still lingered, just out of sight, a soft but constant hum at the edge of her consciousness. She had tried so hard to escape it, to put behind her, but it was clear now. This was never going to be over. The man had been right. The shadow wasn't just her burden. It was something much larger, something that had been watching, waiting. She had thought she understood her fears, her guilt, her regrets, and that in confronting them, she had found a measure of peace. But now, she realized that the darkness she had battled wasn't merely her own. It was a part of a much darker, older force, one that would stop at nothing consume everything in its path. And she wasn't alone. Not anymore. A shiver ran down her spine as she walked through the apartment, her eyes darting to the corners of the room. The light inside her flickered weakly, like a candle in the wind, but the shadow was quieter now, almost too quiet. She had learned to live with it before, but this was different. The doorbell rang again, sharper this time, breaking her from her thoughts. Emma jumped, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't expecting anyone. Who else could it be? Her hand hesitated over the doorknob, but she couldn't ignore it. She opened the door again, her breath catching in her throat as she found herself face to face with a woman this time. She was younger, in her 20s, with a look of quiet desperation in her eyes. Her clothes were unremarkable, but there was something unsettling in the way she stood, on edge, like she was waiting for something. "Are you Emma?" the woman asked, her voice low, almost hesitant. Emma nodded slowly, unsure what to say. "I need to talk to you," the woman continued, her gaze flickering nervously over Emma's shoulder, as if she expected someone or something to be lurking behind her. "It's about the shadow. You've seen it, haven't you?" A chill ran through Emma. How did this stranger know about the shadow? Could this be a coincidence? The man had said there were others. But could she trust this woman? "I've seen it," Emma replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "How do you know about it?" The woman's eyes locked with hers, desperate and haunted. "Because I've been running from it too. And I think it's been after you for longer than you realize." Emma stepped back, allowing the woman to enter, but her mind raced. Another one? How many more were there? And what did this mean for her? For the future? The woman walked into the apartment, her eyes scanning the space, darting from one shadow corner to the next. She took a deep breath, as if steeling herself for something. "I'm Sarah," she said, her voice quieter now. "And I'm here because the shadow, it's only getting stronger. It's hunting more of us. People who've seen it, people who've been marked by it. And I think you're one of the last." Emma frowned, her heart skipping a beat. "Marked." Sarah nodded. "Once you've seen it, it doesn't just leave you. It claims you. It knows you. And it waits for something." Emma swallowed hard, trying to make sense of it all. Her mind felt like it was spinning out of control. The shadow had claimed her. She had known it, fought it, embraced it. But had it really claimed her? Why now? Emma asked, her voice hoarse. "Why are you here now?" "Because," Sarah whispered, her eyes darkening, "it's getting close to the end. The shadow is gathering. It's preparing for something much worse. And we can't stop it alone." Emma recoiled slightly. Preparing for something worse? She turned away, pacing the room, trying to make sense of this new revelation. The shadow had always been a part of her. But now it seemed there was a whole group of people who had been touched by it, marked by it, as Sarah put it. Her thoughts were interrupted by Sarah's voice, low but urgent. "We're running out of time. The shadow is a part of something bigger. There's a cult, Emma, a group that worships it. They know how to control it, and they've been watching you, waiting for the right moment to bring you into the fold." Emma's heart dropped. A cult? Worshipping the shadow? Her breath hitched. She had always believed the shadow was something personal, something she could understand. But now she wasn't so sure. "They want to use you, Emma," Sarah continued. "They want to make you their vessel. And if that happens, the shadow won't just haunt you anymore. It'll consume you, and then it'll take the rest of us." Emma felt a cold sweat form on the back of her neck. She didn't understand everything Sarah was saying, but she understood one thing. The shadow was growing stronger, and she was at the center of it all. "What do we do?" Emma whispered, fear creeping into her voice for the first time in a long while. She had thought she was in control. She had thought she could handle it. But this was beyond her, beyond them all. Sarah stepped forward, her eyes burning with determination. "We find them. We stop them before it's too late. The cult, the shadow. We fight back together." But as the words left Sarah's lips, the room seemed to grow darker. The air grew colder. And from the corner of her eye, Emma saw it, a flicker of movement in the shadows. Something was watching them. The shadow. It was back. And this time, it wasn't just after Emma. It was coming for them both. The room seemed to pulse with heaviness, the air thick and suffocating. The shadows no longer just lingered in the corners. They were moving, stretching, swirling, as if they had a life of their own. Emma's pulse raced. Her eyes darted from corner to corner, trying to track the shifting darkness. But it was everywhere and nowhere. It wasn't just a feeling anymore. She could see it. It was real, and Sarah had noticed it too. Her voice was sharp, breathless, as she stepped closer to Emma, her eyes wide with fear. "It's here. We're not alone." Emma's heart skipped. She knew what Sarah meant. The shadows were no longer an abstract threat, something deep inside her mind or from the past. They had come alive again, pulling at the edges of the room, creeping up the walls, curling at the floor like dark tendrils reaching for their prey. "What do we do?" Emma whispered, fear tightening her throat. "What's happening? I thought we had control over it." But Sarah's face was pale, haunted, as if she had been anticipating this very moment. "We don't have control. Not anymore. The shadow, it controls us now." The shadows surged forward, engulfing the room. They stretched toward Emma and Sarah, their movement predatory, hungry. Emma's mind raced. What did Sarah mean? Hadn't she fought the darkness? Hadn't she found a way to coexist with it? Hadn't the light inside her been strong enough to keep it at bay? But as she watched the shadows inch closer, she realized that everything she had believed had been a lie. The shadow was not something she could fight or control. It was a force much older, far more sinister than she had ever imagined. A force that didn't just exist in her mind. It lived in the world, too, and now it had returned. The shadows closing around them like a suffocating fog. Sarah took Emma's arm, dragging her toward the door. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said, urgency in her voice. "It's looking for us. The cult. They've found us." "The cult?" Emma gasped, confusion rushing through her. "What do you mean? What cult?" "The cult that worships the shadow. They're not just some group of fanatics. They control it. They've been waiting for the right moment to take you, to use you as their vessel, to bring the darkness fully into this world. The shadow, it's their god." The word struck Emma like a blow to the chest. Her head spun. "No, I don't understand. Why me? Why now?" Sarah's grip tightened on Emma's arm as she pulled her down the hallway toward the stairs. "Because you've seen it, you felt it, and you survived. They think you're the key." Emma stumbled, her heart pounding in her chest. The words echoed in her mind. The key. What did that even mean? How could she possibly be the key to all of this? To the shadow? To a cult? They reached the stairwell, and Sarah pushed open the door. The moment they stepped outside, the cold hit them like a wall. The city felt different now, darker, more oppressive. The familiar streets had turned into something unfamiliar, something hostile. Emma's stomach churned with fear. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was bigger than her. The shadow had a purpose, a plan, and now it was coming for all of them. Sarah's voice was low, her words tense. "The cult, they're not just after you. They're after anyone who can feel the shadow, anyone who's been touched by it. They're gathering people like us, preparing for the moment when the darkness takes over completely." "Why? What do they want?" Emma's voice cracked as she tried to process the magnitude of what Sarah was saying. "What do they plan to do?" "The shadow is a being of pure darkness," Sarah explained, her eyes darting around nervously as they walked down the street. "And the cult believes that when it consumes enough souls, when it collects enough fear, it can open a portal to a world where only the darkness exists. They want to bring that world into ours." Emma's legs wobbled beneath her. She stumbled, almost falling, but Sarah caught her, pulling her back to her feet. "We can't let them succeed," Sarah continued, "but we can't do it alone." Emma nodded, but the weight of it all was almost too much to bear. The shadow, the cult, the darkness. Everything felt like it was spiraling out of control, and she had no idea how to stop it, or even how to fight back. But then something happened. The air around them shifted, and Emma felt a pulse of energy, cold and sharp, that shot through her body. She stopped in her tracks, her hand clutched to her chest. A sickening, metallic taste filled her mouth. The shadows were closing in again, but this time they felt different. Closer. "They're here," Sarah whispered, her voice strained. "They found us." Emma looked around. The streetlights flickered, casting long, jagged shadows across the sidewalk. The sound of footsteps echoed behind them, slow, deliberate, as if whoever was following them was savoring every moment. The air thickened with tension, the silence only broken by the approaching footsteps. And then they emerged from the darkness. Figures dressed in dark robes, their faces hidden in shadows, appeared from the alleyways and doorways. Their eyes glowed faintly, a sickly yellow, like they were possessed by something beyond human understanding. The shadows seemed to twist around them, following their every movement. "Sarah, what's happening?" Emma gasped, her heart thundering in her chest. "Who are they?" "They're the cult," Sarah breathed. "They've come for us." The robed figures didn't speak, but their presence was overwhelming. There were too many of them. Emma could feel her pulse racing, the overwhelming fear trying to claw its way back into her chest, threatening to break her. And then one of the figures stepped forward. He was taller than the others, his face hidden beneath a dark hood, but Emma could feel the weight of his gaze on her. "Emma!" His voice was low, commanding, almost hypnotic. "We've been waiting for you. The shadow is calling. Come with us." "No!" Sarah shouted, pulling Emma closer. "You can't have her. She's not your vessel." The man's eyes narrowed. "She is the key. The shadow has chosen her. She will lead us into the new world." Emma shook her head, panic seizing her chest. "No, I won't. I can't." The figure took another step closer, the shadows swirling around him. "You have no choice, Emma. You are already marked. You always have been." Suddenly, the ground beneath them began to tremble. The sky darkened and a low, guttural hum filled the air, coming from the very earth beneath their feet. The cult members began to chant, their voices rising in unison, reverberating through the streets like an incantation. And then Emma saw it. The shadows around her stretched, pulling toward her, as if they were waiting for her to submit, to give in to their power. But this time, she wasn't just facing the darkness inside her. She was facing something far worse, something ancient. She closed her eyes, trying to gather the fragments of strength she had left. The key. The shadow had claimed her, but she refused to be its puppet. It wasn't just a matter of surviving anymore. It was a matter of fighting back. And Emma wasn't going to let the darkness win. The air crackled with tension. The robed figures surrounded Emma and Sarah, closing in from all sides, their chanting rising like a chilling symphony of darkness. The shadows seemed to pulse and twist with each chant, responding to the cult's words, growing more alive with every syllable spoken. Emma could feel the coldness of the shadows wrapping around her, pressing against her skin like invisible hands, squeezing her, pulling her closer to the abyss. Her breath quickened. She could feel the pulse of the darkness, alive in her chest, syncing with her heartbeat. The shadow, it was inside her. But this time it wasn't just part of her. It was something else, something more terrifying, more powerful than she could have ever imagined. The robed man who had stepped forward didn't speak again. His presence alone was enough to command obedience from the cult, his gaze still locked on Emma. She could feel his eyes, cold, calculating, piercing her very soul. He raised his arms, his dark cloak billowing in the wind, and the chanting grew louder, the words unrecognizable, ancient, almost inhuman. The shadows seemed to twist in response, converging around him like a storm cloud. "No!" Sarah screamed, her voice breaking through the chilling chorus of voices. She stepped in front of Emma, as though to shield her. "You can't have her." But the figure remained unfazed, his eyes narrowing. "She is the vessel. The shadow has chosen her. There is no escaping it. We have waited for this moment." Emma's body trembled with fear. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her legs felt like lead. The shadows were suffocating, creeping into her lungs, into her mind, clouding her thoughts. Every breath felt like it might be her last, the darkness wrapping tighter and tighter around her. But then something shifted inside her, a flash of something, her light, a flicker of the power she had once felt, that connection to something stronger than the darkness. It was still there, buried beneath the fear, beneath the shadows, and it was fighting back. Emma closed her eyes, forcing herself to take a deep breath. "Focus," she told herself. She had faced this before. She had confronted the shadows inside her. But now, she wasn't just facing her own darkness. She was facing the ancient, malicious force that had come for her. The cult believed she was a key to opening a door to a world of eternal darkness. They were wrong. She would not be its vessel. She would not let it take over her. The shadows responded to her defiance, swirling violently, reacting to her resistance. They hissed like 1,000 voices whispering in her ears, urging her to give in. Let it take you, they whispered. You are its servant now. No, Emma whispered, her voice shaking but steady. I won't let you win. Sarah turned to her, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and hope. Emma, don't let them break you. You're stronger than this. The chanting grew louder, the word a rhythmic, hypnotic force that threatened to drown out all reason. The robed figure raised his arms higher, and the shadows seemed to respond in kind, swirling in the air around them like a tornado. The pressure on Emma's chest intensified. She felt herself being pulled, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. But in that moment, something inside Emma snapped. She reached deep within herself, searching for the light she had almost forgotten. And there it was, a flickering warmth in her chest, fragile but undeniable. It was her will, her soul, and she would not let the shadow consume it. With a cry, Emma forced her eyes open, and she felt the light inside her surge. It burst through her chest in a wave of pure energy, sending a shock wave through the darkness. The shadow recoiled. The cult gasped, their chanting faltering as the air around them rippled with the force of Emma's power. The figure in front of her staggered back, his hood falling slightly, revealing his face, pale, gaunt, with dark veins running like cracks beneath the skin. His eyes were glowing an eerie yellow, filled with rage. No, he hissed, his voice filled with fury. You cannot resist the shadow. You are its servant. But Emma stood tall, her body trembling but resolute. Not anymore. The shadow lashed out at her, its tendrils reaching for her, trying to reclaim her. But Emma was stronger now. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for Sarah, for everyone who had ever been touched by the darkness. The light inside her flared brighter, pushing the shadow back, pushing the cult back. For a moment, the figures faltered, their chanting dying in their throats. The world around them flickered, like a faulty light bulb struggling to stay on. But then, as quickly as the light had flared, it began to fade. The shadows, though pushed back, were far from gone. Emma's energy was running low, her body screaming for rest. But the cult wasn't finished yet. The man, the leader, was not finished yet. He grinned, his teeth sharp and yellow in the dim light. You are strong, Emma, but strength alone will not save you. He raised his arms again, and this time the shadows didn't just lash at Emma. They consumed her. They wrapped around her like chains, pulling her toward him, binding her to his will. But Emma refused to give in. With every ounce of willpower she had left, she pushed back. Her body felt like it was on fire, the light within her flickering dangerously. But it was her only hope. She had to fight. She had to win. No! Sarah cried out, rushing forward to help. But she was too far. The cult had surrounded them, and their power was too strong. The leader sneered. She is ours. The darkness is ours. And just as Emma thought she might lose herself again, something incredible happened. A crack of thunder split the sky, and for a moment, everything stopped. The shadows faltered. The air seemed to tremble with energy, as if the earth itself had felt the shift in the balance of power. Emma's eyes shot open. Her heart raced, her breath shallow, but her spirit had never been more alive. A force surged through her, something raw, something ancient, something that wasn't a shadow. The light exploded. The shadows screamed as they were torn apart by the surge of power. The cult members cried out in agony, the force ripping through them, breaking their hold on Emma. The leader screamed, his face contorted in rage and pain, but he was powerless to stop the tide of light that washed over him. And then, with a final burst of energy, the light consumed everything. The shadows, the cult, the darkness. And Emma stood alone, her chest heaving, but the shadows were gone. The night was quiet again. The cold was still, and as Emma collapsed to her knees, exhausted but victorious, she knew the fight was not over, but she had taken the first step in reclaiming her life. The night was eerily silent, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Emma knelt in the middle of the darkened street, the remnants of the battle still swirling in the air around her. The oppressive weight that had once clung to the atmosphere seemed to have lifted, but the silence felt unnatural. She could feel the sharp sting of exhaustion, her body trembling from the raw energy she had unleashed. Yet her mind couldn't rest. Not now. The cult was gone. The shadows were gone. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something lingered, a remnant, an echo, deep within her. It was as if the darkness wasn't truly gone. It was simply waiting, biding its time. Sarah crouched beside Emma, her face pale, her eyes wide with concern. "Emma, are you okay?" Emma nodded, but the look in her eyes was far from convinced. I don't know. I should be, but something doesn't feel right. It's like the shadows are still here. Inside me." Sarah's brow furrowed. She touched Emma's arm gently. "No, you broke free from them. You're stronger than that." But Emma wasn't so sure. She had fought with everything she had, pouring every ounce of light and strength into that final battle. And yet, the darkness hadn't truly disappeared. It was too deep, too ancient, to be wiped away in a single moment. It was always there, like a whisper in the back of her mind. "I feel it," Emma whispered, voice cracking. "It's still lingering. It's like I can still hear it, calling to me, waiting for the right moment to return." Sarah's hand tightened around Emma's arm. "You're imagining things. The cult's gone. The shadow's gone. You did it. We did it." But Emma couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She could feel the prickling sensation on the back of her neck, like eyes, dark eyes, were staring at her. It was as if the shadows were still moving around her, just out of sight. The wind picked up suddenly, a chill sweeping through the streets. Sarah shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her, but Emma barely noticed. Her eyes were fixed on the distant horizon, a place where the night seemed darker, thicker than the rest of the city. There, at the edge of her sight, something shifted. A flicker, a movement, something unnatural. "Did you see that?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah squinted into the darkness, but she saw nothing. "See what?" Emma stood up abruptly, her heart racing again. "There's something out there." Sarah grabbed her wrist. "Emma, it's over. The cult is gone. You're safe now." But Emma was already moving, her legs carrying her toward the edge of the street, toward the darkened alley where the shadows seemed to gather like hungry beasts. Sarah followed, but Emma didn't look back. She couldn't. She hadn't known what was there, what was still waiting. As she neared the alley, the temperature dropped again, colder than before. The shadows there seemed to stretch, lengthening as if they were aware of her approach. Her breath caught in her throat, and she felt a sharp, creeping sense of dread crawl up her spine. "Emma," Sarah called, her voice trembling. "Please, let's go. We don't know what's out there." But Emma couldn't stop. It was like an invisible force was pulling her forward, compelling her to move. The closer she got to the alley, the more oppressive the air became. The shadows seemed to breathe, to move, to shift, like living creatures with minds of their own. And then, just as Emma reached the edge of the alley, she saw it, a figure, a dark, tall silhouette standing at the far end of the alley, almost blending into the shadows themselves. The figure was tall, almost impossibly so, and its outline was blurred, as though it wasn't entirely there, as though it was half-formed, flickering in and out of existence. Her heart stopped. It was the figure from her dreams, the one that had haunted her for so long, the one that had stalked her from the shadows, the one whose face she could never quite see. It was here. "Emma." Sarah's voice broke through the thickening fear. "No." But it was too late. The figure stepped forward, its long limbs moving with an unnatural, jerking motion. It didn't walk like a person. It glided, shifting between the shadows as though it was made from the darkness itself. "Emma." The voice came, deep and hollow, echoing in the alley like a whisper from a nightmare. I've been waiting for you. Her blood ran cold. She could feel the weight of the words pressed down on her, suffocating her. It wasn't the cult. It wasn't some external threat. This was something else. This was a shadow. The shadow isn't gone, the voice continued, a low, menacing rasp. It never was. It is always here, waiting, watching inside you. Emma felt the shadows close and around her, curling around her legs, wrapping her arms like shackles. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure stepped closer, its face still hidden in darkness, but the shape of its features were growing clearer. Eyes, blacker than the void itself, gleamed from under the hood, and the mouth, a gaping, twisted thing that stretched far too wide, full of jagged teeth. No! Emma screamed, struggling against the shadows, but they were too strong. Too many. I won't let you have me again. The figure's grin widened, impossibly wide. You already belong to the shadow. There is no escaping it. Sarah tried to reach Emma, but the figure raised a hand, and the shadows twisted violently, blocking her path. She stumbled back, falling to the ground, fear painting her face. Emma, please, she cried. Don't let it take you again. But Emma could feel the darkness filling her, crawling into her skin, weaving its way through her veins. It felt like it was alive, like it was breathing inside her. The suffocating pressure of it was more than she could bear. And then, just as everything seemed hopeless, a spark flared inside her, the light she had once held. Flickering and weak, stirred inside her chest. She had fought it before. She could fight it again. The shadow didn't own her. It couldn't, not if she refused to let it. With a final, desperate scream, Emma forced every ounce of her will into the light within her. The darkness recoiled. The figure faltered, its form flickering like a malfunctioning film reel. You will never control me, Emma cried, pushing back with everything she had. I am not your vessel. For a moment, the alley was still. The figure paused, its form shuddering as though it were trying to hold itself together. And then, suddenly it vanished. The darkness, the oppressive presence, evaporated in a blink. Emma collapsed to her knees, gasping for air. The cold receded, and the shadows dissolved into the night. She was alone again, but the echo of the darkness still haunted her, lingering at the edge of her mind. Sarah rushed to her side, breathless. Emma, it's gone. Emma looked up at her, the fear still gripping her heart. Is it, or is it just waiting? Sarah didn't answer. The question hung in the air unanswered as Emma stared into the night, knowing the battle was far from over. The sun rose the next morning, but Emma felt no comfort in its warmth. The light, though bright, seemed feeble against the lingering cold in her chest. It was as if the shadows had not fully left, merely retreating, waiting for another chance to strike. Emma sat on the edge of her bed, her hands trembling as she clutched the edges of the sheets. Sarah had left hours ago to check in with her family, but Emma hadn't moved since she collapsed in the alley. The quiet of the apartment felt suffocating, a sharp contrast to the violent chaos of the night before. Her thoughts kept returning to that figure, the thing that had emerged from the shadows, the thing that called her its vessel. What did it want with her? And why hadn't it gone away? She glanced at the window, but the sight of the sun-filled sky did little to calm her. She had seen the dark flickers, felt the whispers in the corner of her mind. The shadow was still there, like a bruise on her soul, a mark that wouldn't fade. Her pulse quickened as her thoughts spiraled. What if it comes back? With an effort, Emma stood, pushing away the tangled sheets. She moved slowly, her feet dragging, as if her body were reluctant to face the day. The apartment was eerily quiet, and the air felt too still, like the calm before a storm. Suddenly, a low creak sounded from behind her. Emma froze, her heart slamming into her ribs. Her breath caught in her throat. She didn't move, didn't even dare to blink. It can't be. It's just the house settling, just my imagination, she told herself. But then there was again, a soft, deliberate scrape. She slowly turned toward the sound, her mind racing. The room was empty. The shadows in the corners seemed darker, thicker. There was a flicker of movement just behind her, something that didn't belong. Emma's pulse skyrocketed. No, it can't be. She spun around, eyes wide, scanning the room. The oppressive weight that had plagued her before was back, heavier now, more insistent. Her eyes darted to the mirror on the far wall, her own reflection staring back at her, but it wasn't the reflection that made her gasp. The shadow, the silhouette of something stood behind her, in the mirror's glass. It was tall, too tall, the same as the figure she had seen the night before, the one that had haunted the alley. But this time there was no mistaking it. It wasn't an illusion. She felt the darkness growing stronger, pressing it on her from all sides. It was like the air had thickened. The room itself seemed to shrink, the space closing in. The shadow's presence felt suffocating. It was the same suffocating weight she had felt in the alley, but now it was inside her own home, inside her own mind. "No," she whispered, shaking her head, but the shadow in the mirror moved. Emma's breath caught, her hand shaking as she reached out toward the mirror, her reflection trembling with her. The figure behind her mirrored her actions, its movements smooth, unnatural. It stepped close in the reflection, its body stretching and twisting in ways no human form should be able to. Her reflection smiled, a twisted, grotesque grin that Emma herself could not make. The figure's smile was wide and hungry, its eyes black pits that seemed to draw her in. "It's not mine." In the blink of an eye, the figure's eyes locked with hers, and Emma felt it, the cold, suffocating presence inside her mind. It was no longer just a shadow outside of her. It was in her. It had always been there, lurking just beneath the surface, and now it was closer than ever before. Her reflection spoke, though its lips never moved. "You can't run from me. You can't escape me. You are mine now." Emma recoiled, her breath rapid and shallow. She stumbled backward, knocking over a chair as her panic set in. Her heart hammered in her chest, but her legs wouldn't move. The cold shadow was inside her, in her bones, in her thoughts. "It's not just a thing outside of me anymore." She heard the whisper again, just behind her. "Emma." It was her voice, but not her voice. It was the voice of the shadow, echoing deep within her. "You can't resist forever. The darkness is already a part of you." "No," Emma cried, clamping her hands over her ears, willing the voice to stop. "Go away. Leave me alone." But the shadow only grew stronger. It was pressing in on her mind, a weight too heavy to fight. And just as her knees buckled beneath her, Emma felt her body move without her control, her feet carrying her toward the mirror, toward the dark figure that was no longer just a reflection. Her body moved of its own accord, against her will, and she tried to fight it. But the shadows were too strong. They had her now, locked inside her very soul. The figure in the mirror began to step out, its form growing more solid with each movement, as though it was no longer bound by the glass. "Emma, you belong to me now." The voice was all around her now, in her ears, in her thoughts. The shadows pressed in, surrounding her, wrapping around her like chains. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the ever-deepening darkness. But then, just as Emma thought she might lose herself completely to the shadow, a flash of light flickered inside her, a spark, a small but undeniable warmth. It was her light, the one she had felt before, the one she had summoned in the alley when she fought back. "I can still fight this." Emma gritted her teeth, closing her eyes and focusing on that light. It was small, but it was there. She held on to it with all her strength, willing it to grow, to push the darkness away. The shadow fought back, pressing harder, trying to pull her under, but Emma resisted. The light burned brighter. The shadow screeched, a deep, echoing wail that rattled the walls of the apartment. It was like a storm had been unleashed inside her, and the shadow didn't stand a chance against it. The air crackled with energy, the temperature rising as the light from within Emma flared out of control. "Leave me alone," Emma screamed, her voice shaking but filled with fierce determination. The shadow wavered, faltered, and then with a final, shuddering scream, it vanished. Emma collapsed onto the floor, panting, her heart racing. The air around her was still, and for the first time in what felt like days, the oppressive weight of the darkness lifted. The shadow was gone, at least for now, but she knew better than to think it was over. The battle wasn't finished, and as she lay there, trembling but alive, Emma knew one thing for certain. The shadow might leave for now, but would never stop hunting her. The darkness was always waiting, always watching, and it would come for her again. The days blurred together after battle with the shadow, each one slipping into the next, indistinguishable from the last. Emma tried to reclaim some semblance of normalcy, but the darkness never truly left her. It lingered, hiding in the corners of her mind like an old, familiar enemy, always waiting for the right moment to strike. She returned to her job at the small local bookstore, hoping the familiar routine would help ground her. But every time she turned a corner or passed a mirror, the unsettling feeling crept back, that whispering feeling that something was watching her. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape the sense that the shadows were still there, just below the surface, biding their time. Every night, she lay awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling, convinced she could hear the faintest rustling of movement in the room, the kind of sound that made her question if she was truly alone. She had grown used to the occasional flicker of the shadows at the edge of her vision, or the way the darkness seemed to stretch longer at night, as if something was lurking just out of sight. It had become a constant companion. And the dreams had become more vivid, more real. Each night, Emma was pulled into that same terrifying vision. The dark figure standing just outside her window, its eyes gleaming in the moonlight, its shadow stretched impossibly long, curling around her room like a living thing. The figure would reach toward her, its hands long and twisted, its grin widening until it consumed her, dragging her into the cold abyss of the shadow. When she woke, her body was drenched in sweat, her heart racing, and the echo of the figure's whisper would still be in her ears. "You're mine, Emma. You will always be mine." And that's when the real terror began. It was one of those nights when Emma couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. She had been sitting in her room, staring out the window at the moonlit streets below, when she heard it, a faint melodic sound, a soft hum. At first, she thought it was just the wind or the hum of the old air conditioning unit, but the longer she listened, the clearer it became. The sound wasn't natural. It was a lullaby. It was the same lullaby from her dreams, a haunting melody she couldn't place, one that sounded as if it came from somewhere far, far away. The kind of song that echoed through time, worn by the ages and filled with sorrow. Emma's heart raced as she stood from her chair and walked toward the door, her feet moving of their own accord. The sound was coming from the hallway outside. She hesitated at the threshold, fear rising in her chest like a wave. The shadows outside her room seemed to grow darker, more solid, as if they were reaching toward her. The humming stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, thick and oppressive. Then it started again. The lullaby, soft and eerie, drifting toward her from the hallway. The notes seemed to weave through the air, a strange rhythm that resonated deep within her. No, Emma thought, her breath catching. Not again. She tried to turn back, to lock herself in her room and forget the sound. But the hallway called to her. The shadows seemed to tug at her, urging her forward, and Emma felt a force within her that she couldn't resist. It was as though the shadow had woven itself into the very fabric of the house. The lullaby grew louder as she stepped into the hallway, the darkness closing in tighter around her. She could see it now. At the far end of the hall, standing in front of the bathroom door, was the figure from her dreams. It was tall, impossibly tall, its body a silhouette against the dim light. Its long, twisted arms hung by its sides, and its head was bowed, as if listening to the song it had just sung. Emma couldn't move. "Come closer, Emma." The figure's voice echoed in her mind, sending chills down her spine. "The song is for you. It's always been for you." Her feet moved of their own accord, pulling her closer to the figure. Every step felt like it took an eternity. But before she knew it, she was standing directly in front of the bathroom door, the shadow inches away from her. The figure raised its head, and Emma was met with its face. Its face, if you could call it that. It was a blank, featureless mask, a smooth surface that reflected the dim light around it. But its eyes, were deep pits of darkness, pulling her in like black holes. The lullaby continued, haunting and melodic, vibrating through her chest. "You're so close, Emma. So close to understanding," the shadow whispered, its voice resonating through her skull. "The darkness calls to you, pulls you in. Can you hear it? Can you feel it? The pressure inside her chest tightened, suffocating her. The shadow was here. It wasn't just in her mind anymore. It had crossed into her world. And it was hungry. No. Emma gasped, stepping back, but her legs felt like lead, the darkness pressing closer, suffocating her thoughts. The shadow's grin spread wider, impossibly wide, and for the first time, Emma saw something beneath the mask. A face. A twisted, grotesque version of her own face, distorted beyond recognition, grinning back at her. You are me, Emma. You always were. Emma's stomach churned. She reached out to grab the door handle, but it wouldn't turn. The shadows had wrapped themselves around her, gripping her tighter, holding her in place. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The lullaby was overwhelming now, louder and more insistent, pounding in her skull. Her vision blurred, her thoughts fragmented. The shadow's voice filled her mind, drowning out everything else. You're mine, Emma. There's no escape. You will never be free. Emma screamed, the sound echoing through the house, but the shadow's grip only tightened. She struggled, but it was no use. She could feel the cold fingers of the darkness creeping into her soul, wrapping around her heart. Then something shifted, a sudden burst of light. The shadows recoiled, snapping back like a rubber band, as though the light had burned them. The lullaby ceased, and for a moment, the silence felt deafening. Emma's body shuddered with the intensity of the sudden change, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She could still feel the presence of the shadow, lingering, but it was weaker now. Emma stumbled backward, the bathroom door finally swinging open with a creak. The shadows were gone, but only for now. She could still feel them, watching her from the edges of her mind, waiting for the next opportunity to strike. With shaking hands, Emma slammed the door shut and backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't stay in that house any longer. The shadow was still here, waiting, and it would never let her go. The following days felt like a haze to Emma, as though she were walking through a fog that refused to lift. The figure in the hallway, the lullaby, and the voice still haunted her, always lingering, always present. Her apartment felt more like a prison, the walls closing in as if they were becoming one with the darkness that threatened to consume her every waking moment. She had tried to ignore the dread, to go about her daily life as best as she could, but it was impossible to escape the feeling that something was watching her, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Every corner, every flicker of light seemed like a reminder that she wasn't alone. The shadow was still there, creeping just outside the edges of her vision, and she could feel its pull, its whisper in the back of her mind. Every night, the dreams returned, but they were no longer just dreams. They were becoming more like memories, vivid and haunting. In the dead of night, Emma would wake, drenched in cold sweat, her pulse racing, and the faintest trace of that lullaby would echo in her ears. The presence of the shadow, once distant, was now a constant companion. The worst part was that Emma wasn't sure how much it was real, and how much was her mind unraveling. Had the shadow always been here, waiting for the right moment to take hold of her, or had it only appeared after she first glimpsed it? What if it had been a part of her all along, lurking inside her, feeding on her fear, growing stronger with each passing day? But it wasn't just the dreams that terrified her now. It was the waking hours, too. The shadows were getting bolder. The flickers she'd once dismissed as tricks of the light were now unmistakable. It started small, a shadow creeping under the door when she knew no one was there, a dark shape in the corner of her vision that would vanish when she turned to look. But then it escalated. One morning, Emma awoke to the sound of soft scratching. It was a sound that made her blood run cold, a rhythmic, almost methodical noise coming from just beyond her bedroom door. She froze, not daring to move, straining her ears to listen. Was it just the wind? A tree scraping against the window? No, this was something else. The scratching continued, more insistent now, accompanied by a low, guttural sound, a whisper, just on the edge of hearing. Emma. The voice was muffled, distorted, but unmistakable. It was the same voice she had heard in her dreams. The shadow's voice. Her heart thudded painfully against her ribs. She pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle a scream, but no sound came out. Her limbs felt heavy, paralyzed by a mix of terror and disbelief. The scratching stopped. For a long moment, there was only silence. Emma held her breath, terrified to make a sound, convinced that if she moved, the shadow would pounce. But then, as if it were toying with her, the sound began again. It was coming from the other side of her door, soft at first, like fingernails against wood, then louder, more deliberate. It's here. She couldn't take it anymore. Her body screamed at her to run, to hide, to get away. But her legs wouldn't move. She was frozen, trapped in her own room, with the thing that haunted her lurking just outside. Then the door creaked open. At first, Emma thought it was just the wind. But no, the door didn't just open on its own. She hadn't moved an inch, and yet the door had slowly, silently cracked open, inch by inch, as though something or someone was forcing it. Her heart stopped. Standing there in the doorway, draped in the same swirling blackness that had plagued her for weeks, was a shadow. It wasn't fully formed, but it was unmistakable. The dark figure loomed in the entrance, its features a haze of nothingness. Its body shifted and warped, a mass of ever-changing shadows that danced like tendrils in the dim light. And the eyes, those black pits of void, stared at her with such intensity, such hunger, that Emma felt herself drowning in them. It was all she could see now, the eyes. They were the only thing that mattered. "You can't escape," the shadow whispered, its voice crawling into her skin, sinking into her soul. "You belong to me. You always have." The words were not a threat, but a statement of fact. Emma's mind raced. She knew she had to fight it, had to do something. But every part of her screamed to run. She was paralyzed, rooted in place by a terror so deep, so primal, that it left her feeling powerless, like a mouse trapped in the gaze of a serpent. The shadow moved closer, its form bending and twisting unnaturally. The air around it seemed to distort, as though the space itself could no longer contain its presence. "You've been marked, Emma. You cannot run from what you are." Her breath caught in her throat. Was it truly speaking? Or was it a projection of her mind, the culmination of her fear, her exhaustion? Emma couldn't tell anymore. The line between reality and nightmare had blurred so much that she could no longer separate them. The shadow's form reached out, its hand extending toward her. As it did, Emma felt the darkness rush in, swallowing the space around her. She felt cold, so cold that it pierced her skin, sunk into her bones. But then, a flicker. It was brief, like the light of a dying candle, but it was there, a soft, glowing warmth, the light that had once saved or flickered to life deep inside her. Her hand shot up, as if instinctively. She didn't know how or why she was doing this, but she knew that she had to try. She had to try. The warmth surged from within her, spreading through her chest and outwards, a wave of pure light that pushed against the darkness. The shadow recoiled, its body snapping back like a rubber band, the howling whisper turning into a shrill scream that rattled the walls. It fought against the light, thrashing, but the force was too strong. "No! No!" It screeched, its form beginning to break apart. The light burned, bright and blinding, as the shadow split and twisted in on itself. With one final, violent burst, the shadow shattered, its form dissolving into a cloud of black smoke that dissipated into the air. Emma collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, her hands shaking violently. The light inside her dimmed but remained, a soft glow lingering deep within her, as if it had always been a part of her. She closed her eyes, allowing herself a moment of peace. The shadow was gone. But was it really? She knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. She had fought it, and won for now. But the shadow had made its mark on her, and sooner or later it would return. She could feel it, waiting, watching. It would always be there. Days turned into weeks, and Emma did her best to resume some form of normal life. She returned to work, forcing herself to the motions of a routine that felt increasingly hollow. But the memories of the shadow, the feeling of it wrapping around her, its cold fingers digging into her soul, stayed with her. It never truly left, lingering like an unshakable presence, always just beneath the surface of her consciousness. Even when she was awake, the darkness was never far away. Every time Emma passed a mirror, she could swear she saw something move in the reflection. Something that wasn't her. The shadow, maybe, or maybe it was her mind playing tricks on her. But she knew the truth now. The shadow wasn't just an enemy. It was a part of her, too. The way it whispered to her in her dreams. The way it always knew her fears. It understood her in a way no one else did. But she had fought it once, right? It was gone. For good. Or so she hoped. But the dread never really left. The silence was deafening, almost too quiet, and she could feel the world around her shifting. It was as though every small detail, the way the walls creaked, the hum of the refrigerator, the way the shadows cast themselves at dusk, was just a little too sharp, too pronounced, as if the very fabric of her reality was unraveling. One night, after another sleepless evening, Emma woke to familiar sound of soft footsteps echoing down the hall. Her heart skipped a beat, and her eyes snapped open. The shadows in her room stretched unnaturally, like long, twisted fingers reaching toward her. No, it's not real. It's just my mind. It's just my mind playing tricks. But even as she told herself this, she knew. The footsteps came closer. Emma's pulse quickened as she turned her head toward the doorway. The shadow was there. This time, it wasn't hiding in the corners. This time, it was right in front of her. She saw it. Standing in the doorway, its tall, grotesque form a silhouette against the faint glow of the hallway light. Its body seemed to pulse with darkness, its limbs stretched and shifting in unnatural ways. The air around it rippled, distorting everything in its wake. "You thought you could escape me, Emma?" The voice came, low and mocking, its tone like an echo reverberating deep within her mind. She couldn't breathe. The shadow tilted its head, as if observing her. Its eyes, those hollow, black pits, seemed to sink deeper into her soul, pulling her in with intensity that threatened to tear her apart. It was like the very essence of the darkness was in its gaze, and every inch of her being screamed to look away. But she couldn't. She was paralyzed, locked in its gaze. "You belong to me," it whispered, its voice slithering through the air, cold and taunting. "You always have. There is no escape. There never was." Emma wanted to scream, to run, to fight, but her body wouldn't obey. The shadows were everywhere now, curling around her feet, creeping up her legs, like tendrils of some deep, forgotten abyss. The walls around her seemed to close in, and the room grew colder, so cold that it numbed her very bones. The shadow stepped forward, its form moving like liquid night, the air thick with its presence. Emma tried to move, but it was as if her limbs were made of stone, anchored to the bed. "You were mine the moment you saw me," the shadow continued. Its voice was sweet now, almost hypnotic, "and you'll be mine forever." It reached out toward her, its long, twisted fingers stretching toward her face. Emma's breath hitched as she felt a wave of suffocating dread wash over her. But in that moment, something inside her snapped. A flicker of something deep within her, fought back. She could feel it. A surge of energy, of light, began to build inside her. It was weak at first, like the first spark of a flame. But the more she focused on it, the brighter it grew. She focused on the memory of that first light, the way it had burned through the shadow before. She focused on the hope that had flickered within her when she had thought she was powerless. She focused on the belief that she wasn't completely lost, that there was still a part of her that could fight. The warmth inside her grew, radiating outward, flooding her chest with light. Her hands began to tingle with energy, and before she knew it, the light exploded outward, like a burst of sunlight cutting through the deepest night. The shadow recoiled, its body writhing and snapping back, as if the light were poison to it. The air crackled with the force of the clash between light and darkness. "No, you can't. You're mine." The shadow's voice shrieked, distorted by pain. It twisted and contorted, its form growing more unstable as the light pressed in around it. Emma gasped, her chest heaving as she pushed with all her strength, channeling the light deeper, farther, until it was more than just a burst. It was a flood. The shadow shrieked again, this time in pure agony, as the light consumed it, its form unraveling and dissolving like smoke in the wind. The darkness fought, but it couldn't stand against the force of the light. With one final, desperate howl, the shadow was gone. For a moment, there was only silence. Emma lay on her bed, trembling. Her body was exhausted, and her mind was a storm of conflicting thoughts. The light faded, leaving her with only the dull ache of the battle she had just fought. But there was something else, too, a deep, gnawing feeling like an echo that refused to fade. She had won, but she knew the truth now. This wasn't the end. The shadow would return. It always would. And no matter how many times she fought it, no matter how many times she banished it from her life, the darkness was always waiting, patient, hungry, and eternal. The days that followed Emma's latest confrontation with the shadow felt like a strange limbo, neither peace nor true safety. She had been victorious, yes, but the victory tasted hollow. The shadow had retreated for now, but its presence still loomed in every dark corner of her mind. She tried to move on, to ignore the gnawing sense that it was only a matter of time before it came back. But try as she might, she could feel it lurking, as if it had never truly left. Her apartment had become a prison of sorts, every room cloaked in an unnatural stillness. The walls seemed to close in on her with each passing day, the air heavy with an oppressive weight that she couldn't shake. Every small noise, the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, seemed to be a prelude to something darker, something she wasn't ready to face. Despite her best efforts, Emma had become a prisoner of her own fear. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the room in a dim, amber light, Emma sat by her window, staring into the night. The city outside was alive with noise, but the silence in her apartment felt suffocating. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something was creeping closer. And then, without warning, the lights flickered. Her heart skipped a beat, the familiar anxiety creeping back into her chest. She forced herself to breathe, trying to quell the rising panic. It's just a power grid acting up, she reasoned. Nothing more. But then the lights went out completely, plunging her apartment into darkness. No, not again. Emma's pulse began to race, and she reached for her phone, but the screen was dead. The shadow, she knew it was coming. It was here. The oppressive stillness of the room felt heavier now, as if the very air itself had become thick with malice. She stood up slowly, her legs shaky, and made her way to the door. Each step felt like it took a lifetime. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, her senses screaming that she wasn't alone. The oppressive darkness of her apartment pressed in, and she felt a creeping sense of dread crawl up her spine. The shadows weren't just in the corners. They were alive, shifting and twisting in ways that defied logic. Her heart hammered in her chest as she crept into the hallway, her bare feet making no sound against the cold wooden floor. She stopped at the kitchen, every sense alert, waiting for the inevitable. She felt it, the cold, suffocating chill that could only mean one thing. The shadow was here. Emma? The voice came, soft and far too close, slithering through the darkness like a whisper in her ear. Her breath caught in her throat. There it was again, its voice, the voice that had haunted her nightmares. But this time, it wasn't distant or muffled. It was close, so close she could feel the heat of its breath against her skin. Why do you keep running from me? The voice was low, taunting, like a predator toying with its prey. You can't escape. You never could. The shadows twisted in front of her, slowly taking shape. Emma backed away, her body trembling, but her feet refused to move. The dark figure began to coalesce, slowly, like the ink spilling from a blot on paper, forming a grotesque, shifting shape. The eyes appeared first, those terrible hollow eyes, glinting with an unnatural hunger. Then the rest of it followed, long, spindly limbs and the twisted, contorted form that defied all sense of physics. You've been marked, Emma, it continued, its voice full of malice. You can't outrun your fate. You belong to me. You always have. Her back hit the wall, and she felt a coldness seep into her bones. The shadow stepped closer, its movement unnaturally smooth, like liquid darkness. She tried to scream, to run, but her body was frozen, locked in place by the sheer force of its presence. She could feel it now, just as she had before, a pressure in the air, as though the very room itself were being sucked into a void. The shadow reached out, its fingers long and twisted, inching closer to her throat. And then it stopped. Emma's breath came in ragged gasps. The shadow lingered just inches away, its presence smothering. But it wasn't moving, it was waiting. Why do you hesitate? Emma gasped, her voice a broken whisper. What do you want from me? The shadow's form flickered, rippling like smoke in the wind. Its voice filled the room, louder now, like a chorus of whispers. Your soul is mine, Emma. Your fear is what makes me stronger. I've been feeding on it for so long, you never even knew. But now I need more. The air seemed to freeze. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as the realization hit her like a tidal wave. It wasn't just feeding on her fear. It was her fear. It had been with her all along, woven into the fabric of her very existence. The shadow's face, or what passed for a face, twisted into a grin that stretched unnaturally wide, impossibly wide. It was almost as though the darkness itself had manifested in the shape of a twisted, grotesque mockery of a smile. Emma could feel her mind cracking under the pressure of its gaze. Time to finish what we started, it whispered. Time for you to join me in the dark. And then the world tilted. Emma felt the floor beneath her feet shift. The walls warped, bending like they were made of paper. The light seemed to flicker and die, leaving her in total darkness. She reached out, but there was nothing to hold on to, just empty air. Her pulse raced, and for the first time, she truly understood the extent of the shadow's power. She had fought it before, but this was different. It was no longer just a being from her nightmares. It was her reality. The room around her dissolved, replaced by an endless abyss. There was no sound, no light, just an endless void that stretched in every direction. She was floating weightless, lost in an endless sea of darkness. And in the distance, she could see it, the shadow waiting for her. Welcome, it said. You're finally home. Emma tried to scream, but her voice was swallowed by the vast emptiness. Her words lost in the void. There was no escape, no hope, only darkness. The void stretched infinitely before Emma, an endless expanse of blackness that swallowed her whole. Her body drifted weightlessly in the inky nothingness. Her heart beat loud in her ears, racing against the cold emptiness around her. She couldn't move, couldn't see, couldn't think straight. The crushing pressure of the void seemed to consume everything, her mind teetering on the brink of madness. And then that voice, the voice that had haunted her for so long, returned. Welcome home, Emma, it whispered, the words dripping with an unholy sweetness that sent a chill down her spine. You fought so hard to escape me, but in the end you'll see, you were always mine. The shadow, or whatever it was that had been tormenting her, was here, in this endless nothingness, yet remained unseen. The air pulsed with its presence, like an unseen hand reaching into the depths of her mind, pulling at her sanity, tugging at her very essence. Do you feel it? The voice hissed, circling her like a predator toying with its prey. The pull? The weight of the darkness. It's always been a part of you, Emma. From the very moment you first saw me, you belonged to me. Her chest tightened, her breath shallow as she struggled to form words, to understand what was happening. Was this real? Was this the end? Her heart was still racing, but there was no escape. The darkness had her, had always had her. Why are you doing this? She managed to whisper, her voice trembling as she fought to hold on to whatever shred of her reality remained. What do you want from me? There was a long pause, an eerie silence that stretched on for far too long before the shadow answered. What do I want? It chuckled, low and ominous. I've already taken what I needed, Emma. The rest, it's just a matter of time. The words slithered into her mind like poison. She tried to resist, tried to hold on to the faintest hope that there was a way out of this hell. But the shadow's presence was suffocating. She felt its weight on her chest, its fingers digging into her very soul, pulling her deeper into the abyss. But then, through the suffocating blackness, something shifted. A flicker. At first, it was barely perceptible, just a brief spark of light that vanished as quickly as it appeared. Emma's heart skipped. Was she imagining it? Her eyes darted around, try and find the source of the flicker, but there was nothing, only the endless dark. And then another spark. This time, it was brighter, more distinct. It pierced through the darkness like a shard of glass in a storm. She reached out instinctively, her fingers grasping for the light, as if it were the only lifeline left in this void. The shadow hissed in displeasure, its form twisting, becoming more solid, more menacing. "No!" The voice screamed, its tone raw with anger. "You don't understand, Emma. This is where you belong. This is your destiny." But Emma didn't listen. She wasn't going to surrender. She couldn't. The light flickered again, stronger this time, illuminating a sliver of the nothingness around her. She followed it, desperate, determined to escape. The shadow writhed and hissed, its presence growing darker, more overwhelming. But the light, it pulled her like a magnet, like something ancient and powerful. She clung to it, her hands shaking as she reached for it, grasping with every ounce of strength left in her. For a moment, everything else seemed to vanish. The darkness receded. The shadow's oppressive weight lifted, and Emma felt her body move forward, pulled by an invisible force. The voice screamed, but it was distant now, muffled as if it were fading into the background. The light grew brighter, and Emma's surroundings began to shift. The abyss seemed to warp, bending and distorting, like reality itself was coming undone. The infinite blackness was being torn apart, ripped open by the very force of the light. And then Emma saw it. A door. It was faint at first, a barely visible outline in the distance. But it was there. A door of light, a doorway that offered an escape from the suffocating nightmare. She could feel it calling to her, feel the warmth and safety that lay beyond it. Without thinking, she surged forward, her body propelling itself toward the light, toward the door. The shadow's voice grew frantic now, almost frantic, but Emma's resolve was unwavering. She was done with the darkness, done with the fear, the torment, the endless cycle. She had to escape. The door was closer now, the light blinding, its edges sharp and brilliant. As she reached out for the door, a rush of air enveloped her. She was as close, so close to freedom, but just as her hand touched the doorknob, the shadow scream pierced the air. It was louder now, raw, primal. The darkness surged forward one last time, a tidal wave of malice, trying to swallow her whole. The shadow reached out, its tendrils curling around her ankles, around her wrists, pulling her back, dragging her into the depths. But Emma wouldn't be taken again. With one final cry of defiance, she gripped the doorknob with all her strength, turning it with a force that seemed to shake the very fabric of the void. The door creaked open, and with it came a surge of light, so blinding that Emma had to close her eyes. But she didn't stop. She stepped through. Everything shifted. For a moment, there was only white light, and then the world snapped back into focus. She found herself standing in her apartment, panting, gasping for air. Her surroundings were unchanged. Nothing had changed. But the suffocating weight of the shadow, the cold presence that had followed her, was gone. She could feel it, deep in her bones, gone. The silence that filled the room was different now. It wasn't the heavy, oppressive silence of the void, but something lighter, something that made her feel like she was breathing again. She was free. But as she stood there, catching her breath, something lingered in the back of her mind, a feeling she couldn't shake, a whisper, a fleeting thought that slipped into her consciousness like an echo. The shadow was gone for now, but it wasn't gone forever. It would always be waiting. And Emma knew, deep in her heart, that the darkness would return. But for tonight, she was free. Emma's hands shook as she clutched the edge of the countertop, her breath shallow, her pulse racing. She stood there in the middle of her kitchen, the light above her flickering faintly as though it, too, was uncertain of her reality. Her heart thudded in her chest, louder than it had ever been. But the suffocating weight of the darkness that had once consumed her was gone, replaced by an unsettling silence. She was home, but it didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a fragile veneer of normality, like the thin skin of a fruit that had begun to rot beneath the surface. The shadow is gone for now, Emma thought, but even she couldn't convince herself of the finality of it. The feeling that something was still out of place, something was still watching, hadn't left. The sensation of the unseen eyes, the lingering whispers that teased the edges of her consciousness, were never far from her thoughts. It wasn't just the fear that she was used to now, the unease that hummed in her chest. It was a certainty that something was wrong. The door, the light, the escape, it had been too easy. And then the thought crept in, cold and unwelcome. What if the shadow hadn't just let her go? What if it was still there, waiting for her to believe she was free? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. Emma snapped herself out of the dark spiral of her own mind. She couldn't afford to fall apart again, to give in to fear. She had to be strong. But how could she be strong when the very walls around her felt like they were closing in? She quickly moved through the apartment, turning on every light, the soft glow flickering like small beacons against the lingering darkness. The familiar hum of the city outside could be heard faintly through the windows, but inside, everything felt too quiet, too still. "Everything is fine," she repeated, trying to calm herself, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're okay. It's over." Her eyes flickered toward the mirror across the room. She froze. In the reflection, there was a shadow, but it wasn't hers. It was a fleeting glimpse, just a small silhouette in the corner of the glass, a shape that didn't belong. She could feel her breath catch in her throat as she turned slowly, her heart skipping a beat. The room was empty, just as it had been moments before. No one stood behind her. No one was there. But she knew that shadow. It was the same shadow, the same dark presence that had haunted her before. No, no, no. She forced herself to take a breath, to steady herself. It had to be a trick of the light. Her mind was still reeling from everything she had just been through. But deep down, she felt it. The pull, the gravity that tugged at her soul, reminding her of the abyss, of the darkness, of the entity that she thought had been banished. Emma turned away from the mirror, shaking her head. She had to focus. She couldn't let it control her anymore. She grabbed her phone from the counter and dialed the one number she thought she could trust. Her brother, Matt. He was the only family she had left, the only person who had ever truly understood her, even when things got strange. The phone rang and she waited. Her thumb tapped nervously against the edge of the screen as the seconds stretched on. When the voicemail kicked in, she cursed under her breath. She hung up and tried again and again, but still no answer, the silence pressing on her, thick and suffocating. She let out a frustrated sigh, and the room felt smaller, the air colder. Her eyes darted around the room again, searching for any sign of movement, any flicker that would suggest she wasn't truly alone. Her gaze fell on the kitchen window. Through the glass, the city lights twinkled faintly in the distance, but something about the way the shadows stretched across the streets made her uneasy. The night felt wrong, like it was hiding something just out of reach. Then the phone buzzed in her hand, jolting her from her thoughts. It was a text from Matt. "Emma, don't trust what you see. It's not over. You need to leave now." Her blood ran cold. She read the message again, her mind struggling to comprehend the words. He'd always been there for her, but this was different. Why was he saying this? The phone buzzed again. "They've been following you. Don't trust the mirrors." A chill ran through her body as she looked toward the reflection in the kitchen window. It was a fleeting glimpse, but there it was again, the shadow, in the glass, just out of the corner of her eye. It was moving, slowly, deliberately. Her heart skipped. She stumbled back, her legs nearly giving way beneath her. The mirror, it was the mirror. The reflection of the shadow flickered, as if unsure of itself. The black form twisted in the glass like it had a mind of its own, a shape that didn't follow the same rules of the world she knew. The longer she stared, the more it grew, the more it moved, the more it shifted. She forced herself to tear her gaze away, but the feeling lingered. The sensation of being watched, of something lurking just beyond the edge of her vision, was unbearable. She felt as though the very air around her was tightening. The phone buzzed again. "Emma, don't turn around." Emma froze. Her blood ran cold. The voice from the message wasn't Matt's. It was the shadow's. And then she heard it, a soft, whispering voice that echoed through the apartment, as if it came from every direction at once. "Emma, It wasn't Matt. It wasn't anyone she knew. It, the shadow. And before she could stop herself, before she could even think about the consequences, she turned. The moment her body pivoted, she felt a wave of darkness crash over her. And there it was. A figure stood in the doorway to the living room. Tall, unnaturally thin, its body indistinguishable from the shadow that had tormented her. The blackness of it stretched across the walls like a crawling parasite, its form twisting and pulsating with malevolent energy. "Do you think you can escape me?" The voice whispered, low and guttural, but its words resonated in her very bones. "You belong to the darkness, Emma. You will always return to me." Emma took a step back, the fear consuming her. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came. The shadow began to step toward her, its limbs elongating in grotesque ways. Her hands trembled, but she couldn't move. The air thickened. The weight of her past, of all the fears she had tried to escape, crashing back into her. She had fought so hard to get away. But now it was clear. There was no escape from the shadow. Not this time. Not ever. Emma stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding wildly. The shadow, the entity that had tormented her for so long, loomed before her, its form stretching and shifting, like smoke caught in a breeze. It was as if reality itself bent and twisted around it, the walls of her apartment warping, the air growing thick and suffocating. "You think you can escape me?" The voice hissed again, sending a chill straight to her core. It was like the whisper of a nightmare she couldn't wake from, a truth she could no longer deny. The shadow wasn't just some lingering fear. It was part of her, a part of the very fabric of her existence. No matter how far she ran, how hard she fought, it would always be there. Emma's legs wobbled, her body shaking as she fought to control the overwhelming urge to scream. She had faced this before, hadn't she? This terror, this overwhelming presence. But now, in this moment, there was no turning back. It was here, inside her home, in her reality. Her eyes darted to the mirror once more, and for the first time, she understood. The reflection in the glass was no longer just a mere shadow. It was alive. A twisted, corrupted version of herself. Its eyes black as night. Its mouth stretched in an inhuman grin. The reflection raised its hand, beckoning her. "No." Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. She could feel it. A pull deep inside her, like gravity, a force stronger than anything she had ever known. The shadow inside the mirror was calling her, urging her to step into its dark embrace. But as Emma stood there, her mind racing, she realized something she hadn't understood before. This wasn't just a battle between her and the shadow. It was a battle for her soul. The darkness wasn't something that could be defeated. It was a part of her. It always had been. And now, the only way to end it, to finally be free, was to face it head on. The shadow, sensing her inner struggle, let out a low, mocking laugh. "You think you can overcome me? You cannot." Emma's body trembled, her chest tight with fear. But deep down, she knew the truth. The fear had been part of the cycle, the endless loop she had been trapped in. It wasn't about defeating the shadow. It was about accepting it, embracing the darkness within her, and choosing to move forward despite it. She took a step toward the mirror, her movements slow, deliberate. The shadow recoiled, its form rippling as if it were trying to retreat. But it couldn't. It was bound to her, connected to her, a reflection of everything she had ever feared. Emma reached out and touched the cold surface of the mirror. The chill from the glass shot up her arm, sending a shiver through her spine. But instead of pulling back, she pressed her palm harder against it. She felt a surge of energy course through her body, a strange sense of power rising from within. It was the same energy she had felt when she first discovered the shadow, the same force that had tormented her all these months. But now, instead of fear, she felt something else control. "You are not my master," Emma said, her voice steady, though her heart was still pounding in her chest. "I am not yours." The shadow roared in fury, its form twisting violently, but Emma stood her ground. She could feel it fighting against her, trying to pull her into its depths, but this time She wasn't going to let it win. This time, she wasn't going to let it define her. She wasn't going to run anymore. "I don't need to be afraid of you," Emma said, her voice louder now, echoing throughout the apartment. "I am not broken. I am whole." With that declaration, something changed. The mirror cracked, a jagged line splitting across the glass like a spiderweb. The shadows formed flickered and flickered, its voice growing fainter as if it were being pulled into the crack, pulled into oblivion. And then, with a deafening silence, it was gone. The apartment, once thick with the presence of the shadow, was now still. The oppressive weight that had filled the room lifted, leaving behind only the faint hum of the city outside the window. Emma stood there, breathless, staring at the cracked mirror where the shadow had once been. She was alone. The darkness was gone. And yet, Emma knew, deep in her soul, that the journey wasn't over. The shadow may have been banished, but it had taught her something profound. Darkness and light, fear and strength were always connected. We all carry shadows within us, and they can never truly be erased. But that doesn't mean they have to control us. Emma took a deep breath, a small, fragile smile tugging at the corner of her lips. It wasn't over, not really, but for the first time in what felt like forever, she was free. And whatever came next, she would face it on her terms. The end. Thank you for following Emma's journey through the darkness. What do you think? Was the shadow truly defeated, or will it return in a new form? Leave your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe for future stories of fear and survival.